Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into gripping true crime cases, real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The evening of May 16, 2020, began with a desperate call for help from a remote stretch of road on the Winnebago Indian Reservation in Nebraska. A vehicle had become stuck in the mud along BIA Road 50, also known as Honey Creek Road, and the stranded passengers needed assistance. The call came from 22-year-old Kausy Montana Featherstone Medicine Top Dora, a young Ho-Chunk woman who had her entire life ahead of her. She was with her partner, Jonathan Daniel Rooney, and their 4-month-old son. What should have been a simple rescue turned into one of the most disturbing cases the reservation had ever seen. A tragedy that would expose the harsh reality of violence against indigenous women and leave a family shattered by unimaginable loss. Kausy was born on July 18, 1997, in Wausau, Wisconsin, the daughter of Marvin Dora Sr. and Stella Medicine Top. She carried a name steeped in history and tradition, connected to one of the most prominent families in Ho-Chunk history. The Dora family traced its lineage back to Glory of the Morning, a powerful chiefess who ruled her people with wisdom and strength in the 18th century. According to oral history, the name Dora itself came from Ho-Po-Kaw, the daughter of a powerful Ho-Chunk chief who was selected around 1727 to succeed her father and lead their nation. To carry this name meant carrying the weight of generations, a legacy of leadership and resilience that stretched back nearly 3 centuries. Kausy was a mother of 3 young children, including the infant son she shared with Jonathan Rooney. Those who knew her described her warmth and spirit, the way she loved her children and tried to build a life for them despite the challenges she faced. She and Jonathan had been living together in an apartment in Walt Hill, Nebraska, on the Omaha Nation Indian Reservation. But beneath the surface of their domestic life, there were cracks, tensions that would eventually explode into violence on that May evening. Just before 8 o'clock on that Saturday evening, the Winnebago Police Department received the call for assistance. Conservation Officer Peter Snowball responded immediately, driving out to the remote location to help the stranded couple. When he arrived at approximately 8 p.m., he found the vehicle stuck in the mud, but nobody was inside. The car sat empty and abandoned, its occupants nowhere to be seen. Officer Snowball radioed dispatch to ask if the couple had been found on foot, but they had not. When he attempted to leave the area around 9 o'clock, his own vehicle became stuck in the same treacherous mud, forcing him to walk out and meet another conservation officer, Benjamin. The 2 officers regrouped at the police station, where they learned from fire department personnel that Kausy lived in Walt Hill. They drove there with assistance from local police, checking the apartment where Kausy and Jonathan lived, but found no one home. A neighbor confirmed the couple had not returned. Something about the situation felt wrong. Why would a couple with an infant simply vanish after their vehicle became stuck? On their way back to Winnebago, the conservation officers decided to check some cabins on private property near Honey Creek Road. They arranged to meet Second Assistant Fire Chief Jonathan Grant and Fireman Kyle Abanek at the entrance to the property. At approximately 11:50 p.m., the 4 men proceeded on foot up a hill to the first cabin, which they found empty. They decided to check a second cabin on the other side of a valley, and as they moved through the timberline, Officer Snowball noticed something unsettling. A red glow on the hilltop across the valley, like the light of a fire burning in the darkness. The officers called out, but received no response. They pressed forward toward the second cabin, and as they approached, they saw a pair of black boots sitting on the south side of the structure. Officer Snowball knocked on the cabin door, and after waiting a moment, he opened it and stepped inside. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. A man was lying under a blanket on a mattress with a clothed infant. When the officer's flashlight beam swept across the scene, the man sat up, and Officer Snowball immediately noticed he was completely naked. The man was Jonathan Rooney, and his first words were telling. "Where is she? Where's my clothes? Are you the rescue party?" Officer Snowball confirmed he was there to help and asked where Kausy was. Jonathan's response was casual, almost dismissive. "She went outside to get cell service." The officer looked around the cabin and saw an infant car seat, a cell phone, a wallet, a baby bag, and a can of baby formula scattered on the floor, but no pants, no underwear, no shirt belonging to Jonathan. Officer Snowball radioed dispatch at 12:10 a.m. to report he had located Jonathan and an infant, but that Kausy was still missing. He stepped back outside to regroup with the other officers and formulate a plan to find her. That was when he took a closer look at the fire that had been burning just 5 to 7 yards from the cabin. The fire pit contained a burning outhouse and a large tree branch, but there was something else, something that made Officer Snowball's blood run cold. Among the flames, he saw a round, white object and what looked like a bone lying next to it. Both Officer Snowball and Fireman Abanek agreed that the round object resembled a skull, and both noticed the fire had an odd, sickening smell that neither man could quite identify. Officer Snowball brought Assistant Fire Chief Grant over to examine the fire pit, and they quickly came to a grim conclusion. They were looking at human remains. The officers made a strategic decision not to tell Jonathan what they had found in the fire. Instead, they would transport him to the police station while they continued to search for Kausy. Jonathan emerged from the cabin with a blanket wrapped around his waist and immediately asked about his clothes. Officer Snowball told him they had not found any clothing and that he would be taken back to the police station while officers continued looking for Kausy. Jonathan picked up a wallet, cell phone, and can of baby formula, and Officer Snowball handed him the diaper bag. Assistant Fire Chief Grant then transported Jonathan and the infant back to the Winnebago Police Department. The investigation that followed would reveal a story of violence, destruction, and a desperate attempt to conceal a terrible crime. Jonathan Daniel Rooney, who was 25 years old at the time, had killed Kausy Dora and then burned her body in an effort to destroy the evidence. The fire had been so intense, so complete in its destruction, that investigators could not determine a definitive cause of death. The remains had to be identified through dental records, and when those results came back, they confirmed what everyone had feared. The body in the fire pit belonged to Kausy. As Jonathan sat handcuffed and naked in the back of a police cruiser at the station, covered only by a small blanket, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Samuel Roberts arrived at the Winnebago Police Department at approximately 3:08 a.m. after receiving a call that human remains had been found. By that time, conservation officers had returned to the crime scene and confirmed not only the presence of human remains in the fire pit, but also blood inside the cabin, in the doorway, and on the front porch. Officer Anthony Walker, a federal police officer with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had been on duty that night and observed Jonathan when he arrived at the station. He only knew Jonathan and his family from religious functions in their small community. He noted that Jonathan did not appear intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, but rather appeared normal, as if it was just any other day. Jonathan had visible physical injuries to his face, shoulder, and arm area, with scratch marks that suggested a struggle. His hands were dirty and dark, and he smelled strongly of smoke from the fire. During the hours that followed, law enforcement questioned Jonathan multiple times. In his initial statements, he claimed not to know where Kausy was, suggesting she had gone to see a friend in Sioux City. But the physical evidence told a very different story. When asked about his relationship with Kausy, Jonathan admitted that he sometimes put his hands on her, acknowledging a history of physical violence. Investigators found additional evidence that painted a clearer picture of what had transpired that night. Not far from the outhouse and the cabin, officers discovered an abandoned vehicle containing a gas can and a chainsaw. These items suggested premeditation, tools that could be used to carry out and cover up a violent crime. When Jonathan Daniel Rooney was arrested on June 1, 2020, nearly 3 months after Kausy's death, he was charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter occurring in Native American country, and destruction of evidence. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case went to trial in December 2021, and the prosecution presented a devastating theory of what had happened on that May evening. According to prosecutors, Kausy and Jonathan had gotten into an argument at the remote cabin. The argument escalated beyond words, beyond shouting, until Jonathan attacked Kausy in or near the outhouse. The assault was fatal, and their 4-month-old son was the sole witness to the violence that took his mother's life. After killing Kausy, prosecutors argued, Jonathan removed his clothes, which were likely covered in blood. He then set the outhouse ablaze, with Kausy's body inside, in a calculated attempt to destroy any evidence of what he had done. The prosecution emphasized Jonathan's history of violence toward Kausy, suggesting that the argument that night was the final breaking point in an abusive relationship. The evidence presented at trial was largely circumstantial, as the intense fire had destroyed most physical traces of what had occurred. But prosecutors pointed to several key facts. Jonathan and Kausy were the only 2 adults present at the cabin that night. Kausy's blood was found both inside and outside the cabin. Jonathan had fresh scratch marks on his face and upper body, consistent with defensive wounds from a struggle. Witnesses testified that Jonathan and Kausy had been fighting in the time leading up to her death. Most damning of all was the location of Kausy's remains in the fire pit and Jonathan's presence at the scene, naked and with their infant son, just yards away from where her body burned. Jonathan's defense attorneys took a different approach, one that many found deeply troubling. They suggested that Kausy might have caused her own death, painting her as someone who frequently had dark thoughts about ending it all. The defense argued that just because Jonathan was present at the scene did not mean he was responsible for what happened. The defense also challenged the reliability of the evidence, particularly the cadaver dog alerts and phone data that prosecutors relied upon. They argued that their client was a victim of overzealous prosecution, with one defense lawyer referring to the investigation methods as the Bardstown Inquisition. The defense emphasized repeatedly that there was no body in a conventional sense, no definitive crime scene, and no physical evidence that definitively linked Jonathan to murder. Perhaps most controversially, the defense disregarded Jonathan's documented history of violence and abuse toward Kausy. They chose not to address this pattern, instead focusing on creating reasonable doubt about what had actually occurred that night. For Kausy's family, watching the defense attempt to blame their daughter and sister for her own death was agonizing. They knew the truth about Jonathan's violence, about the fear Kausy had lived with, about the pattern of abuse that had culminated in her murder. But in a courtroom, where the burden of proof rests with the prosecution, creating doubt is often enough. On December 16, 2021, after hearing all the evidence, the jury reached its verdict. Jonathan Daniel Rooney was acquitted of the second-degree murder charge, but the jury found him guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a lesser-included offense. He was also convicted of tampering with evidence for his role in burning Kausy's body and destroying the crime scene. The conviction on the manslaughter charge carried a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison, along with a possible fine of up to $250,000 and a 3-year term of supervised release. The tampering with evidence charge carried a potential penalty of up to 20 years. On March 11, 2022, Jonathan Rooney appeared before United States District Judge Robert F. Rossiter Jr. for sentencing. Kausy's family had waited nearly 2 years for this moment, 2 years of grief and anger and unanswered questions. Before the sentence was issued, they described in a victim impact statement how Kausy's death had completely upended their lives. They spoke of the hole she had left behind, of the children who would grow up without their mother, of the pain of knowing she had died in terror and violence. Judge Rossiter sentenced Jonathan Rooney to a total term of 300 months in prison, 25 years, combining the sentences for both convictions. It was the maximum sentence allowed under the charges for which he had been convicted. Jonathan maintained his innocence even as the sentence was handed down, and he filed an appeal challenging both his conviction and the length of his sentence. Jonathan's legal team raised three primary issues on appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. First, they challenged the denial of his motion to suppress custodial statements he had made to law enforcement on the night Kausy disappeared. Jonathan's lawyers argued that his statements should have been excluded because they were obtained in violation of his Miranda rights and were not made voluntarily. Second, the defense challenged the sufficiency of the evidence supporting the manslaughter and tampering convictions. They argued that the circumstantial nature of the case, combined with the lack of a definitive cause of death, meant the jury could not have reasonably concluded Jonathan was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Finally, Jonathan's attorneys argued that his sentence was both procedurally and substantively unreasonable, claiming it was too harsh given the circumstances of the case. On March 28, 2023, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals issued its decision, affirming Jonathan's conviction and sentence. The appellate court found that Jonathan's waiver of his Miranda rights was voluntary, considering all the circumstances surrounding the ongoing search for Kausy and the conditions in which he was held and questioned. The court explained that a close review of the record established that a jury could have reasonably concluded Jonathan was guilty of manslaughter based on the evidence presented at trial. The appellate court noted that the jury had heard evidence that Jonathan and Kausy were the only two adults present at the cabin, that Kausy's blood was found both inside and outside the structure, that Jonathan had scratch marks consistent with a struggle, and that witnesses had testified about fighting between the couple in the time leading up to her death. The court found there was sufficient evidence for the jury to conclude that Jonathan had put Kausy's body in the fire, destroying any evidence of the cause of death. Finally, the Eighth Circuit rejected Jonathan's argument that his sentence was substantively unreasonable, finding that the district court had properly considered all relevant factors in imposing the 25-year term. Despite Jonathan Rooney's conviction and the lengthy sentence he received, many questions about that terrible night remain unanswered. The intensity of the fire meant that investigators could never determine exactly how Kausy died. Was it the attack itself that killed her, or did she die in the fire? Did she suffer? How long did the violence last? These are questions that will haunt her family forever. There are also questions about warning signs that might have been missed and interventions that could have saved Kausy's life. Jonathan's admission that he sometimes physically assaulted Kausy suggests a pattern of domestic violence. Were there opportunities to intervene earlier? Did Kausy reach out for help that never came? The prosecution mentioned Jonathan's history of violence at trial, but it remains unclear whether Kausy ever made an official complaint or sought protection orders. The presence of the 4-month-old infant throughout the ordeal adds another layer of tragedy to the case. That child, too young to remember but forever marked by that night, witnessed his father's violence against his mother. The baby was found unharmed physically, sleeping peacefully next to his naked father in the cabin, while his mother's body burned just yards away. The psychological impact of what that child experienced, even if he cannot consciously recall it, is immeasurable. Kausy Dora's life was cut short at just 22 years old, but the legacy of strength she carried in her name lives on. She was descended from leaders and warriors, from women like Glory of the Morning who ruled with wisdom and courage. She was trying to build a life for her 3 children, trying to create something better despite the challenges and violence she faced. Her family has ensured that her memory endures not just as a victim, but as a beloved daughter, mother, and member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. They have channeled their grief into advocacy, working to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. They have kept Kausy's story alive, refusing to let her become just another statistic in the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The conviction of Jonathan Rooney brought a measure of justice, but it cannot bring Kausy back. It cannot give her children their mother, or repair the hole torn in her family's hearts. What it can do is serve as a reminder that violence against Indigenous women will not be tolerated, that their lives matter, and that those who harm them will be held accountable. On that May night in 2020, when Kausy Dora made that desperate call for help from a muddy road on the Winnebago reservation, she could not have known it would be her last. She was trying to get home, trying to care for her infant son, trying to survive another day in a relationship marked by violence. The help she called for arrived too late to save her, but not too late to seek justice for her death. Kausy's story is a tragedy, but it is also a call to action. It demands that we recognize the epidemic of violence facing Indigenous women, that we address the systemic failures that leave them vulnerable, and that we honor their lives by working toward a future where no more mothers, daughters, and sisters are lost to violence. In remembering Kausy Dora, we remember not only how she died, but how she lived, as a mother who loved her children, as a young woman with dreams for the future, and as a bearer of a name that represented generations of strength and resilience. Story 2. The summer night of July 3rd, 2015, began like countless others in the quiet Kentucky town of Bardstown, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where front porches welcomed neighbors and church bells marked the passing days. But for 35-year-old Crystal Rogers, a mother of 5 children whose smile could light up a room, that Friday evening would be the last time anyone would see her alive. She vanished without a trace, leaving behind not just her children and family, but a mystery that would haunt a small community for an entire decade. Crystal had spent the evening at the Houck family farm with her boyfriend, Brooks Houck, a man she had been involved with for several years. They shared a 2-year-old son named Eli, and Crystal had brought her other children from previous relationships into their blended household. Brooks later told investigators that Crystal stayed up late that night playing games on her phone, a seemingly ordinary detail that would become part of the last known account of her alive. According to Brooks, she was still at home when he last saw her, but by the next morning, Crystal Rogers had disappeared into thin air. 2 days later, on July 5th, 2015, a discovery along the Bluegrass Parkway sent chills through everyone who knew Crystal. Her burgundy 2007 Chevrolet Impala sat abandoned on the side of the highway, its hazard lights still blinking in the summer heat. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her purse, her cell phone, and her keys still dangling in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious clues about what had happened. But there was one detail that would later prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. The car had a flat tire. Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, was beside herself with worry. Her daughter would never have abandoned her children willingly, would never have disappeared without explanation. Crystal was devoted to her 5 children, always putting their needs first, always making sure they felt loved and secure. The fact that Brooks Houck waited 2 days before filing a missing person report struck many as suspicious, including Crystal's family. Why would someone wait so long to report their girlfriend and the mother of their child missing? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. From the beginning, Brooks Houck became the primary focus of the investigation. As the last person known to have seen Crystal alive, he faced intense scrutiny from law enforcement and the community alike. He maintained his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with Crystal's disappearance, but his explanations often seemed incomplete or contradictory. He claimed Crystal had left their home on her own that morning, but he couldn't explain where she might have gone or why she would have left her children behind. The Houck family farm, a sprawling 245-acre property, located on Pascal Ballard Lane, just south of downtown Bardstown, became central to the investigation. The farm, owned by Brooks' mother, Rosemary Houck, was the last place Crystal was known to be alive. The property would be searched multiple times over the years as investigators desperately sought any trace of what had happened to Crystal. As weeks turned into months and months stretched into years, Crystal's family never stopped searching. Her mother Sherry became a tireless advocate, appearing on television shows, organizing searches, and pressuring law enforcement to keep the case active. The pain of not knowing what happened to her daughter, of not being able to properly mourn or find closure, was a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. But Sherry refused to give up hope that one day the truth would emerge from whatever dark place it had been hidden. The tragedy that had befallen the Rogers family was far from over. On November 19, 2016, Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, was out hunting on family property when someone shot and killed him. The circumstances were immediately suspicious, and authorities believed the murder was connected to Crystal's disappearance. Tommy had been one of the most vocal advocates for finding his daughter, relentlessly pursuing any lead, questioning anyone who might know something, refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. His death sent shockwaves through Bardstown and left the Ballard family reeling from yet another devastating loss. Now Sherry had lost both her daughter and her husband, both under mysterious and violent circumstances that seemed impossibly cruel. The unsolved murder of Tommy Ballard added another layer of darkness to an already heartbreaking case, and many believed his death was meant to silence his search for the truth about Crystal. For years, the case seemed to stall. Despite multiple searches of the Houck property and extensive interviews with potential witnesses, no arrests were made. Crystal's body was never found, and without physical evidence of a crime, prosecutors faced significant challenges in bringing charges. The FBI eventually took over the investigation, dedicating substantial resources to solving the mystery. Agents conducted searches involving more than 150 state and federal personnel, using cadaver dogs, excavating portions of the Houck farm, and following up on hundreds of tips. Brooks Houck continued living his life in Bardstown, maintaining custody of Eli, the son he shared with Crystal. This arrangement was agonizing for Sherry Ballard, who desperately wanted to maintain a relationship with her grandson. Court battles over visitation rights became another painful chapter in the family's ordeal, with judges eventually ruling that the hostility between the Ballard family and Houck posed too great a risk of emotional harm to the child. Sherry was denied visitation rights, cutting her off from a living connection to her missing daughter. Throughout these years, rumors and speculation swirled through Bardstown. People whispered about what might have happened on the Houck farm that July night, about whether Brooks had acted alone or had help, about where Crystal's remains might be hidden. The case became one of Kentucky's most notorious unsolved disappearances, featured on true crime podcasts and television shows, analyzed by amateur detectives across the internet. But for Crystal's family, it wasn't entertainment or a puzzle to solve. It was a living nightmare that continued day after day with no end in sight. In September 2023, nearly 8 years after Crystal vanished, the case finally cracked open. A Nelson County grand jury returned indictments against 3 men, though authorities initially kept many details sealed. Joseph Lawson, then 32 years old, was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and complicity in tampering with physical evidence. The indictment didn't initially name a victim, but the dates corresponded exactly with Crystal's disappearance, and her family confirmed they had been notified. 2 months later, in December 2023, Joseph's father, Steve Lawson, was arrested and indicted on similar charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The Lawsons were known to have connections to Brooks Houck, and as the prosecution would later reveal, they allegedly played crucial roles in helping to cover up Crystal's murder. Then came the arrest that Crystal's family had waited nearly a decade to see. Brooks Houck was taken into custody without incident at a work site and charged with murder and tampering with physical evidence. Prosecutors alleged that Houck had either killed Crystal himself or caused her death through actions showing extreme indifference to human life. The arrest brought both relief and renewed anguish for the Ballard family, who knew that convicting someone of murder without a body or crime scene would be an enormous challenge. Special Prosecutor Shane Young, who took over the case in 2022, faced the daunting task of building a murder case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no body, no crime scene investigators could definitively identify, no murder weapon, and no witnesses to the actual killing. What prosecutors did have was a web of suspicious behavior, contradictory statements, and physical evidence that painted a damning picture. Cell phone data emerged as crucial evidence. Records showed Brooks Houck's movements on July 3, 2015, including trips to the family farm that didn't align with his initial statements to police. Surveillance footage from Bardstown businesses captured Houck driving to the farm before 4 in the afternoon, then leaving and returning with Crystal just before 7:30 that evening. According to Houck's own statement, he only went to the farm with Crystal once that day, but the video evidence told a different story. Prosecutors built their theory of the case around motive and opportunity. They argued that Brooks and Crystal's relationship was deteriorating, and that Brooks feared losing custody of their young son Eli. This fear, the prosecution contended, drove him to murder. Evidence presented to the grand jury revealed that Brooks had engaged in an extramarital affair shortly before Crystal disappeared. A woman testified that she had a sexual encounter with Houck in the basement of a construction site less than a month before Crystal went missing, contradicting his previous claims of being faithful. The prosecution's theory suggested that Crystal was killed on the Houck family farm, the last place she was known to be alive. Cadaver dogs had alerted to the scent of human remains on the property during searches, though no actual remains were discovered. The 200-acre farm provided countless places where someone could conceal evidence, and despite exhaustive searches over multiple years, Crystal's body remained hidden. One seemingly minor detail became pivotal in connecting the conspiracy. After Crystal's murder, someone needed to dispose of her car, and prosecutors alleged this task fell to Joseph Lawson. Joseph reportedly drove Crystal's Chevrolet Impala away from the murder scene, but fate intervened in an unexpected way. The car got a flat tire. When Joseph found himself stranded on the Bluegrass Parkway with a disabled vehicle, he called his father Steve for help. Steve Lawson then made a crucial mistake, a 13-second phone call to Brooks Houck around midnight. This brief communication would later help prosecutors establish the connection between the three men and their alleged conspiracy. Steve Lawson eventually admitted to helping his son move Crystal's vehicle after she disappeared. According to his own testimony, Joseph drove the car and Steve picked him up when it had a flat tire, leaving the vehicle on the side of the Bluegrass Parkway. Steve pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence for his role in moving the car. This testimony provided crucial corroboration for the prosecution's theory, though it was not allowed in the subsequent trials due to legal restrictions. The three defendants faced trial in 2025, 10 years after Crystal vanished from Bardstown. Steve Lawson was tried first, in May 2025, and was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. The jury sentenced him to 17 years in prison for his role in helping to cover up the crime. Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson were tried together in a proceeding that captivated the community. The trial, held in Bowling Green after being moved due to extensive pretrial publicity, began in late June 2025. For weeks, prosecutors presented their circumstantial case, weaving together cell phone records, witness testimony, surveillance footage, and expert analysis. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were victims of overzealous prosecution and police coercion. One defense lawyer referred to the interrogation methods as the Bardstown Inquisition, suggesting that investigators had pressured witnesses into making statements that fit their theory of the case. The defense emphasized repeatedly that there was no body, no crime scene, and no physical evidence definitively linking their clients to murder. Throughout the trial, prosecutors revealed that Brooks Houck's mother Rosemary and his brother were considered unindicted co-conspirators in the case. Brooks' sister, Rhonda McIlvoy, testified during the trial and denied being part of any plot to murder Crystal. She provided an alibi for the day Crystal disappeared, stating she was at the Kentucky Science Center in downtown Louisville with her husband and children, and even provided police with photographs from that day. On July 8, 2025, after days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Brooks Houck was found guilty on all charges, murder and tampering with physical evidence. Joseph Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the verdicts were read, with Crystal's family finally hearing the words they had waited a decade to hear. On September 17, 2025, Brooks Houck stood before Nelson Circuit Judge Charles Sims III for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with Crystal's family and supporters, all there to witness this crucial moment. Sherry Ballard, who had endured 10 years of unimaginable pain, stood to address the court and the man convicted of murdering her daughter. Her statement was raw and powerful, filled with the anguish of a mother who still didn't know where her daughter's remains lay. "Tell me where my daughter is," Sherry said directly to Houck, her voice carrying the weight of a decade of grief. "That's your forgiveness. I will be at every parole meeting. I will bring an army with me if that's what it takes to keep you behind bars." Judge Sims sentenced Brooks Houck to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Joseph Lawson received the maximum 25-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Both men maintained their innocence and filed appeals. The custody battle over Eli, the son Brooks and Crystal shared, was finally resolved in January 2026. Brooks agreed to allow his sister Rhonda McIlvoy to have permanent custody of the boy, who was now 12 years old. For Sherry Ballard, this development was bittersweet. While she was still denied direct access to her grandson, at least he was no longer in the custody of the man convicted of killing his mother. Despite the convictions and the long-awaited justice, critical questions remained unanswered. Crystal Rogers' body has never been found. Without her remains, her family cannot properly lay her to rest, cannot visit a grave, cannot have the closure that comes with a final goodbye. The question of where Crystal's remains are hidden continues to haunt everyone involved in the case. The murder of Tommy Ballard, Crystal's father, also remains officially unsolved, though many believe it was connected to his daughter's disappearance. The FBI and local authorities continue to seek information about his death, hoping that solving one case might shed light on the other. For Sherry Ballard, the pain of losing both her daughter and husband under violent and mysterious circumstances is a burden few could imagine bearing. There are also questions about the extent of the conspiracy and whether others were involved. Prosecutors identified Brooks Houck's mother and brother as unindicted co-conspirators, but no charges were filed against them. The decision not to prosecute other potential participants has left some wondering whether everyone responsible has been held accountable. The disappearance and murder of Crystal Rogers fundamentally altered the town of Bardstown. What was once a quiet, close-knit community became the subject of national media attention and true crime fascination. The case exposed divisions within the town, with some supporting the Houck family and others standing firmly with the Ballards. The heightened security at the courthouse during the trials, particularly when Rosemary Houck was present, spoke to the tensions that still simmer beneath the surface. For law enforcement, the case represented both a triumph and a challenge. Successfully prosecuting a murder without a body, crime scene, or weapon demonstrated the power of careful investigative work and the importance of building a comprehensive circumstantial case. The FBI's involvement and the dedication of resources over many years showed a commitment to solving even the most difficult cases. But the investigation also revealed how challenging it can be to bring justice when crucial physical evidence is missing. Crystal Rogers was more than a true crime story, more than a mystery to be solved. She was a daughter, a mother, a sister, a friend. She was a woman who loved her 5 children fiercely, and who deserved to watch them grow up, to see them graduate and get married and have children of their own. Instead, her life was cut short at 35, stolen away on a summer night in 2015. Her mother Sherry's transformation from grieving mother to tireless advocate ensured that Crystal's case never faded from public consciousness. Through television appearances, interviews, and constant pressure on law enforcement, Sherry kept her daughter's name alive and kept the investigation moving forward. Her strength in the face of incomprehensible loss became an inspiration to other families dealing with missing loved ones. The case also highlighted the particular challenges of prosecuting murders without bodies, raising awareness about how such cases require different investigative approaches and legal strategies. The successful convictions in Crystal's case may provide a roadmap for other jurisdictions facing similar situations. As the years pass and the appeals process unfolds, one truth remains constant. Crystal Rogers has never been forgotten. Her smile, captured in photographs that her family shared with the media over the years, continues to remind everyone of the vibrant woman who was lost. Every July 3rd, when the anniversary of her disappearance arrives, the community of Bardstown remembers. They remember a mother who loved her children, a daughter who was cherished by her family, and a woman whose life mattered. Somewhere in the rolling hills and farmland of Kentucky, Crystal's remains lie hidden. Her family continues to hope that one day, someone will reveal where she is, allowing them to finally bring her home. Until that day comes, they carry her memory forward, ensuring that Crystal Maria Rogers will never be reduced to just another cold case statistic, but will always be remembered as the beloved mother and daughter whose disappearance and murder shook a small Kentucky town to its core. The convictions of Brooks Houck, Joseph Lawson, and Steve Lawson brought a measure of justice after 10 long years. But for Sherry Ballard and the rest of Crystal's family, true closure remains elusive. As Sherry made clear in her powerful victim impact statement, they will never stop asking the question that haunts them every single day: where's Crystal Rogers? Story 3. The morning began like so many others in the quiet suburb of Camp Hill, Brisbane. Hannah Clark woke her 3 children with gentle kisses and reassuring words, helping them dress for another day of school. Aaliyah, 6 years old with her mother's smile, was excited about her lessons. Lyanna, moved with the boundless energy of a child who saw each day as an adventure. Little Trey, only 3, clutched his favorite toy as his mother buckled him into his car seat. None of them could have known that this ordinary Wednesday morning on February 19th, 2020, would become the day their story ended in unimaginable horror. Hannah, 31 years old, had spent years building a life she could be proud of. A former trampolining champion who had represented Queensland for 4 consecutive years and earned international medals, she had transformed her athletic discipline into a passion for fitness that touched countless lives. Together with her husband Rowan Baxter, a former rugby league player for the New Zealand Warriors, she had established Integra 8 and CrossFit SMC, a gym in Mansfield where she poured her enthusiasm into helping others discover their strength. Her parents, Lloyd and Sue Clark, had even invested money to help the young couple get the business on its feet, believing in their daughter's dreams and the family she was building. But behind the photographs of smiling faces and successful business ventures, a darkness had been growing for years. What had once seemed like attentiveness had slowly transformed into surveillance. What had appeared to be concern had gradually become control. Rowan Baxter did not simply love Hannah, he sought to possess her completely. He monitored her movements constantly, appearing unexpectedly at locations she visited, his presence a reminder that privacy was an illusion. He would rifle through her handbag and phone, searching for evidence of independence or betrayal. When she worked at their gym, he would call precisely when she should be locking up, interrogating her about whether anyone was with her, his voice carrying an edge of accusation, even when she had done nothing wrong. The control extended to every aspect of Hannah's existence. She was forbidden from wearing pink or shorts, even while teaching CrossFit classes where such clothing would have been practical and comfortable. Baxter dictated what the children could do, imposing his will on their young lives as thoroughly as he imposed it on their mother. Most devastating of all, he forced Hannah to submit to him every night, and if she refused or showed reluctance, he would punish her with days of cold silence and emotional manipulation. These were not the actions of a partner, but of a captor who had convinced the world he was simply a devoted husband. Hannah tried to leave. The courage required to walk away from an abuser is immense, particularly when that abuser has spent years convincing the victim that she would be nothing without him, that leaving would make her a terrible mother, that the children would suffer if the family was broken. Yet Hannah found that courage, not once but 3 or 4 times in the final year of the relationship. Each time, Baxter would deploy his considerable skills of manipulation, weaving narratives that made her question her own judgment, that made her believe the failure was hers rather than his. Each time, he would promise change, offer temporary concessions, play the role of the remorseful husband just long enough for her to return. By November 2019, the situation had escalated beyond psychological torment. Baxter's behavior had become more aggressive, his control more desperate as he sensed Hannah's determination to break free growing stronger. On one occasion, he placed his hand on Hannah's neck, a gesture that was both a threat and a promise of what he was capable of inflicting. When Hannah tried to retrieve photographs from Baxter's possession, he grabbed her wrists and forced them behind her back, holding her in a painful grip. Sue Clark, Hannah's mother, witnessed the attack and screamed at Baxter to release her daughter. When he finally let go, calling Sue a crude name, Hannah was left with a sprained wrist and a split lip. The mask was slipping, revealing the violence that had always lurked beneath the surface. In early December 2019, Hannah made the decision that would define the final months of her life. She gathered her 3 children and left their home, seeking refuge with her parents Lloyd and Sue Clark. The relief must have been overwhelming, the sense of finally escaping the suffocating atmosphere of fear and control that had pervaded every moment of their daily existence. But Baxter called incessantly, telling Hannah that she was hurting the children, that her actions were destroying the family he claimed to cherish. On December 6th, Hannah went to the Carina police station to make a formal report, beginning the process of documenting the abuse she had endured. The terror reached a horrifying crescendo on Boxing Day, December 26, 2019. Hannah had agreed to meet Baxter, so the children could try out the new skateboards they had received for Christmas. It was meant to be a simple, supervised interaction, a brief moment of normalcy for the sake of the children, who missed their father despite the chaos he had created. As Hannah crossed the road, Baxter suddenly grabbed Lyanna, their 4-year-old daughter, and ran to his car. Hannah screamed, her voice desperate and frantic, as she watched Baxter drive away with their child. One bystander who witnessed the abduction was so certain she had seen a kidnapping that she immediately rushed to inform the police. But the legal system failed Hannah in that critical moment. Because there were no family court orders or child protection orders in place, Baxter had not technically broken any law by taking his own daughter. Detective Sergeant Harris later testified that despite Baxter brazenly abducting Lyanna in front of witnesses, removing her from Hannah's care against her will, there was nothing police could do to charge him with a crime. The action was considered disturbing enough to warrant a domestic violence order, but Baxter himself remained free. He kept Lyanna for 3 days, taking her to a friend's house in New South Wales. The friend, displaying the same callousness as Baxter, sent Hannah a text message telling her this was her fault, that she should not have kept the children from their father. The psychological torture of not knowing where her daughter was, whether she was safe, whether she would ever see her again, was unbearable. When Lyanna was finally returned, Hannah obtained a domestic violence order against Baxter. The order was supposed to protect her and the children, to create a legal barrier between them and the man who had demonstrated such contempt for their safety and well-being. In late January 2020, the order was varied at the Holland Park Magistrates Court, allowing Baxter to regain access to his children. He had successfully presented himself as a reasonable father who simply wanted to be part of his children's lives, hiding the calculating cruelty that defined his true nature. The custody negotiations revealed the depth of Baxter's obsession. Through mediation, Hannah offered him 165 days of custody per year, a generous arrangement that would have given him significant time with the children. The offer was so reasonable that even Baxter's own lawyer advised him to accept it. But Baxter refused to sign the consent order that would make the agreement legally binding. He demanded 50-50 custody, equal shared care, and he would accept nothing less. As one source close to the situation observed, it was not really about the children at all. It was about Baxter's inability to move past his relationship with Hannah. In early February 2020, during a child exchange, the fragile arrangement shattered. Hannah discovered large photographs of herself in her underwear inside Baxter's car. The images were a violation, a reminder that even in separation, he continued to objectify and possess her. When she confronted him and attempted to destroy the photos, Baxter grabbed her arms and twisted them violently behind her back, trying to break her wrist. He was charged with breaching the domestic violence order, and his access to the children was immediately suspended. He was allowed only to speak to them twice a week via video calls, supervised interactions that must have filled him with rage at his loss of control. Baxter's lawyer advised him to seek another mediation session and finally sign the consent order for shared custody, to work within the system and demonstrate that he could be a cooperative co-parent. But Baxter was beyond reason now. He was due to appear at the Holland Park Magistrates Court to face charges for breaching the domestic violence order. The legal consequences were closing in, the walls of accountability tightening around a man who had spent years evading any real punishment for his actions. In his twisted logic, if he could not have Hannah and the children on his terms, if he could not control and dominate them as he believed was his right, then no one would have them at all. On the morning of February 19th, 2020, Hannah followed her routine. She was staying with her parents in their Brisbane home, finding safety and support in the people who had loved her since birth. She loaded Aaliyah, Lyanna, and Trey into her car, preparing to drive them to school. The children chattered and laughed, innocent of the danger that was about to destroy their world. As Hannah started the car, Baxter suddenly appeared and jumped into the passenger seat. He was holding a container of petrol, and his voice was cold as he told her to drive. Hannah's heart must have been hammering with terror as she understood what was happening. At 8:30 in the morning, on Raven Street in Camp Hill, she pulled the car over, perhaps hoping that someone would see them, that help would arrive before Baxter could carry out whatever he had planned. But there was no time for rescue. Baxter doused the interior of the car with petrol, splashing it over Hannah, over the children strapped helplessly in their seats. Hannah would have been pleading with him, begging him to spare the children even if he intended to hurt her. Then Baxter set the petrol alight. The flames erupted with terrifying speed, consuming everything inside the vehicle. Witnesses who were nearby heard screams that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bystanders rushed to the scene, desperate to help, and somehow managed to pull Hannah from the burning car. Her clothes were on fire, her skin blistering and blackening as the flames ate through tissue and muscle. "He's poured petrol on me," she screamed to those trying to save her. "Save my children," she begged, her voice breaking with agony and desperation. But Baxter blocked the rescuers, preventing them from reaching the children trapped inside. Aaliyah, Lyanna, and Trey were burning alive while their father ensured that no one could intervene. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. One passerby who attempted to reach the car suffered facial burns from the ferocity of the fire. Inside the vehicle, the 3 children died, their small bodies unable to withstand the flames. As the car continued to burn with his children inside, Baxter grabbed a knife and stabbed himself to death. Emergency responders arrived to find him lying near the vehicle, beyond any possibility of revival. Hannah was rushed to the Royal Brisbane Hospital with burns covering 97% of her body. Only the soles of her feet remained unburned, a cruel detail that emphasized the totality of her suffering. The doctors did everything they could, but the damage was catastrophic. Hannah Clark died that evening, surrounded by the family who had tried so hard to protect her, having endured hours of unbearable pain. Lloyd and Sue Clark, who had welcomed their daughter and grandchildren into their home just months earlier with the hope of keeping them safe, now faced the unthinkable reality that all 4 were gone. Australia was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence and the systems meant to protect victims. The murders sparked a national debate that revealed how poorly equipped authorities were to recognize and respond to coercive control, the pattern of psychological abuse and domination that Baxter had inflicted on Hannah for years. Deputy State Coroner Jane Bentley, who presided over the inquest into the deaths, concluded that every agency which had engaged with Hannah failed to recognize the extreme risk she faced. This failure occurred in part because Baxter had no history of physical violence and no criminal record prior to the murders. The system was designed to respond to overt acts of physical aggression, but it was blind to the insidious damage caused by control and psychological manipulation. The coroner found that even if authorities had fully understood the danger, it was unlikely they could have stopped Baxter from executing his murderous plans. He was not mentally ill, Magistrate Bentley stated. He was a master of manipulation who had spent years perfecting his ability to present one face to the world while inflicting cruelty in private. Hannah's fears had been genuine and realistic, ultimately confirmed in the very worst way imaginable. There had been a missed opportunity to charge Baxter after he breached the domestic violence order in early February, but overall, the support provided to Hannah was deemed adequate and appropriate given the understanding and resources available at the time. The tragedy revealed not individual failures but systemic ones, gaps in laws and training and awareness that left vulnerable people exposed to lethal danger. Sue Clark described how Baxter had controlled what Hannah wore, where she went, who she spoke to, turning her life into a prison without bars. The Clarks pushed for landmark reforms in how police and courts respond to domestic violence. Magistrate Bentley recommended the creation of a specialized police station model with dedicated officers, support workers, child safety personnel, and legal advisors to provide comprehensive assistance to victims. She cited evidence that such stations in countries like Brazil and India had reduced female homicide rates, offering hope that systemic change could save lives where individual interventions had failed. The coroner also called for better training for police, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and judges to recognize the warning signs of coercive control and understand its correlation with intimate partner homicide. Hannah's story became a catalyst for legislative change across Australia. Her parents advocated tirelessly for coercive control to be recognized as a criminal offense, arguing that waiting for physical violence before intervening was tantamount to waiting until it was too late. They explained that the most reliable indicator of homicide risk was not bruises or broken bones, but the amount of control a perpetrator exercised over a victim. Research had shown for years that separation was the most dangerous time for victims of coercive control, that leaving an abuser who had built their identity around domination often triggered a violent response. Hannah had been trying to protect herself and her children by leaving Baxter, but the very act of asserting her independence had sealed their fate. The fitness community that Hannah had been such a vibrant part of honored her memory with tributes and workouts dedicated to her name. Hannah Clark had been a trampolining champion, a fitness instructor, a businesswoman, a daughter, and above all, a mother who loved her children with a fierceness that never wavered even in her final moments. When the flames consumed her, her last coherent words were pleas to save Aaliyah, Lyanna, and Trey. Lloyd and Sue Clark take pride in knowing that their daughter fought until the very end, that she tried to protect her children even when facing unimaginable horror. Hannah's warrior spirit, forged through years of athletic competition and strengthened by her determination to escape abuse, shone brightest in those final moments when she refused to accept her fate quietly. The question that haunts everyone who learns Hannah's story is how this could have been prevented. The domestic violence order, the police reports, the custody negotiations, the criminal charges against Baxter for breaching the order, all of these were pieces of a system that should have protected Hannah and her children, but ultimately proved inadequate against a man who had decided that if he could not control them, they should not exist. Magistrate Bentley's conclusion that Baxter was likely unstoppable once he had made his decision offers little comfort. Only the cold acknowledgement that some people are willing to destroy everything rather than accept that other human beings have the right to make their own choices. On average, one Australian woman is murdered every 9 days by a current or former partner, and police respond to a domestic violence call every 2 minutes. Hannah Clark's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern of violence that continues to devastate families across the country and around the world. The morning of February 19th, 2020, began with Hannah Clark preparing breakfast for her children and ended with all four of them gone, their lives stolen by a man who believed he owned them. In the years since, their story has become a rallying cry for change, a reminder that protecting victims of domestic violence requires more than restraining orders and court appearances. It requires a fundamental shift in how society understands power and control in relationships, how institutions recognize warning signs before violence erupts, and how communities support those trying to escape situations that have become dangerous. Hannah Clark deserved better from the systems meant to protect her. Her children deserved to grow up safe and loved. That they did not is a failure that should weigh on everyone who has the power to create change and chooses not to use it. Story 4. In the summer of 2012, Star City, West Virginia, was the kind of place where teenage friendships felt like they would last forever. The small town, nestled in the Appalachian foothills just south of Morgantown, was home to close-knit communities where everyone knew their neighbors and high school bonds ran deep. For Skyler Niece, a bright 16-year-old with an infectious laugh and a reputation for kindness, her two best friends were the center of her social world. Shalia Eddie and Rachel Schoaf were not just friends but confidants, the kind of girls who spent hours together talking about boys, school drama, and dreams for the future. They posted photos on social media, made inside jokes, and created the kind of memories that define adolescence. But beneath the surface of their friendship, something dark was growing. A resentment so profound that it would lead to one of the most shocking crimes in West Virginia history. Skyler was born on February 10, 1996, to Mary and Dave Niece, a couple who had waited years for a child and cherished their daughter with a devotion that defined their lives. She grew up in a modest apartment in Star City, where her bedroom window overlooked the parking lot and where she filled her space with the typical trappings of teenage life: posters, photos of friends, makeup scattered across her dresser. Those who knew her described a girl who was friendly and outgoing, someone who worked part-time at a local Wendy's and took her responsibilities seriously even while navigating the complicated social landscape of high school. Her friendships with Shalia and Rachel seemed unbreakable. The three girls were inseparable throughout their freshman and sophomore years at University High School, posting photos together on Twitter and planning sleepovers and late-night adventures. But as the school year progressed and summer 2012 arrived, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their friendship. There were tensions, arguments that Skyler's parents noticed, but assumed were the normal ups and downs of teenage relationships. What they could not have known was that Shalia Eddie and Rachel Schoaf were harboring something far darker than typical adolescent conflict. On the evening of July 5, 2012, Skyler finished her shift at Wendy's and returned home to the family apartment. She spent the evening with her parents, relaxing after work, nothing about the night suggesting it would be anything other than ordinary. Around midnight, after her parents had gone to bed, Skyler received a message on her phone. Shalia and Rachel wanted to pick her up for a late-night drive, the kind of spontaneous adventure that teenagers crave during the long summer nights when curfews feel restrictive and freedom beckons. Skyler climbed out of her bedroom window at 12:30 in the morning on July 6, 2012. The apartment's security camera captured her in grainy black and white footage, walking across the parking lot in shorts and a hoodie, heading toward a light-colored sedan idling in the shadows. She got into the car, Shalia Eddie's vehicle, and the footage shows the sedan pulling away and disappearing into the darkness. It was the last time anyone would see Skyler Niece alive. Her parents woke the next morning to an empty apartment. Skyler's bedroom window was still open, a detail that immediately alarmed her father. She had not taken her cell phone charger, her contact lenses, or the solution she needed for them, items she would have grabbed if she had been planning to be away from home for any length of time. Dave Niece felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. Something was wrong. He and Mary began calling Skyler's friends, starting with Shalia and Rachel. Both girls claimed they had no idea where Skyler was. They expressed concern, posted worried messages on social media, and joined in the search efforts that were beginning to organize in the community. On Twitter, they wrote heartfelt pleas for Skyler to come home, tagging photos of their missing friend with hashtags that spread across the internet. "Please come home," they wrote, their words dripping with a false sincerity that would later sicken everyone who read them. The Niece family reported Skyler missing to the Star City Police Department, but their desperation collided with bureaucratic obstacles. At the time, West Virginia law required a 48-hour waiting period before a teenager could be officially classified as missing. An Amber Alert could not be issued immediately because there was no evidence of an abduction or danger, just a teenage girl who had climbed out of her window in the middle of the night. Law enforcement initially treated Skyler as a runaway, a classification that enraged her parents, who insisted their daughter would never simply disappear without telling them. Mary and Dave Niece took matters into their own hands. They printed thousands of flyers with Skyler's photo, her bright smile captured in happier times, and plastered them across Monongalia County. They organized search parties, contacted media outlets, and posted pleas on social media, begging anyone with information to come forward. Days turned into weeks, and the silence was unbearable. There were no credible sightings, no phone calls, no ransom demands. Skyler had simply vanished. Meanwhile, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf continued to play the role of grieving friends. They attended vigils, comforted Skyler's parents, and spoke to investigators, providing a timeline of events that seemed to clear them of any involvement. They claimed they had picked Skyler up that night to drive around and smoke marijuana, a common teenage activity that did not seem particularly suspicious. They said they had dropped her off about an hour later near her apartment, and that was the last time they had seen her. Investigators had no reason to disbelieve them, at least not initially. But as summer turned to fall, inconsistencies began to emerge. Police reviewed the security footage from the Niece apartment and noticed that the timeline Shalia and Rachel had provided did not match the video evidence. When questioned again, Shalia finally admitted that the car seen on the footage was hers, a detail she had initially omitted. The admission raised immediate red flags. Why had she lied? What else was she hiding? In September 2012, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the West Virginia State Police officially joined the investigation, recognizing that Skyler's disappearance was not a simple runaway case but something far more sinister. They began interviewing Skyler's classmates, teachers, and friends, slowly piecing together a picture of the relationships and tensions that had defined the final months of her life. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Several students reported that in the weeks leading up to Skyler's disappearance, they had overheard Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf talking about killing her. The conversations had been dismissed as teenage dramatics, the kind of exaggerated threats that adolescents sometimes make in moments of anger or frustration. No one had taken the girls seriously. No one had reported what they heard to an adult or to authorities. It was a collective failure that would haunt everyone who had dismissed those overheard conversations as mere jokes. As the investigation intensified, Rachel Schoaf began to unravel. The weight of what she and Shalia had done was crushing her, manifesting in deteriorating mental health and increasingly erratic behavior. In December 2012, both girls agreed to take polygraph tests, even though investigators knew the results would not be admissible in court. Shalia failed the test, but she remained defiant, refusing to change her story. Rachel, however, was crumbling. On the way to her polygraph test, she jumped out of her father's moving car and ran to Shalia's house in a moment of panic and desperation. Shortly afterward, she suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. In early January 2013, Rachel Schoaf could no longer carry the secret. She confessed to authorities that she and Shalia Eddy had murdered Skyler Niece. The confession was detailed and chilling, revealing a plot that had been planned and executed with cold calculation. According to Rachel's account, she and Shalia had grown to resent Skyler. The exact reasons remain murky. Some reports suggest jealousy over social status. Others point to tensions and arguments that had escalated over the school year. When investigators asked Rachel why they had killed their friend, her answer was as simple as it was horrifying. "We just didn't like her." The plan had been hatched in the summer of 2012. Shalia and Rachel decided to lure Skyler out of her home under the pretense of a late-night drive, take her to a remote location, and kill her. On the night of July 6th, they drove Skyler across the state line into Pennsylvania, to a wooded area in Wayne Township, Greene County, where they could commit the murder without being seen. They told Skyler they wanted to smoke, a familiar activity that would not have raised any alarms. The three girls got out of the car and walked into the woods. At some point, Shalia and Rachel claimed they had forgotten to bring a lighter. When Skyler turned her back to walk toward the car to retrieve one, the two girls counted to 3. On 3, they attacked. They had brought kitchen knives from their homes, and they used them without hesitation. Skyler fought back desperately, managing to wrangle one of the knives from Rachel's hand, and even cutting Rachel's leg in the struggle. But there were 2 of them and only one of her, and they stabbed her over and over again, more than 50 times, until she stopped making any noise. The brutality of the attack was almost incomprehensible. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of rage. It was sustained, methodical violence inflicted by 2 people who had once called Skyler their best friend. After Skyler was dead, Shalia and Rachel attempted to dig a hole to bury her body, but the rocky Pennsylvania soil proved too difficult to penetrate. Instead, they covered her corpse with branches, leaves, and brush, hiding it as best they could before driving back to West Virginia. They cleaned the blood from the car, disposed of their bloody clothing, and returned to their lives as if nothing had happened. For the next 6 months, Skyler's body lay in those woods, hidden beneath the leaves, while her parents searched desperately and her killers posted tributes to her on social media. Rachel's confession led investigators to the site in Wayne Township. On January 16, 2013, authorities recovered skeletal remains from beneath the brush. Scientific analysis confirmed what everyone already feared. The remains were those of Skyler Niece. She had been dead since the night she climbed out of her bedroom window, her life stolen by the 2 people she trusted most. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. On May 1, 2013, Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In her plea agreement, she admitted to unlawfully, feloniously, willfully, maliciously, and intentionally causing the death of Skyler Niece by stabbing her and causing fatal injuries. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Shalia Eddy was more defiant. On September 4, 2013, West Virginia prosecutors publicly identified her as the second perpetrator and announced she would be tried as an adult. She was indicted on charges of kidnapping, first-degree murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. She pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked her to the crime scene, and Rachel's testimony provided a detailed account of her role in the murder. Eventually, Shalia changed her plea, and she too was convicted. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. In May 2023, Rachel Schoaf became eligible for parole and appeared before the West Virginia Parole Board. Mary and Dave Niece attended the hearing, determined to ensure that their daughter's voice was heard. They listened as Rachel described the murder as a mistake, a characterization that infuriated them. Dave Niece spoke directly to the board, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. She had every chance in the world to back out of that, and she chose not to. So she didn't make a mistake, she made a choice. The parole board denied Rachel's request, and she remains incarcerated. Shalia Eddy, meanwhile, will not be eligible for parole until 2028. She remains in a West Virginia correctional facility, her name forever associated with one of the most senseless murders in the state's history. The murder of Skyler Niece had reverberations far beyond the courtroom. Her case exposed gaps in West Virginia's missing persons laws, leading to the passage of Skyler's Law in 2013. The legislation modified the state's Amber Alert system to allow for immediate public announcements when any child is reported missing and believed to be in danger, eliminating the 48-hour waiting period that had delayed the search for Skyler. It was a small measure of justice, ensuring that no other family would have to wait helplessly while precious hours slipped away. The question that haunts everyone who learns about this case is the simplest and most unanswerable. Why? Why would two teenage girls plan and execute the murder of their best friend? The motive, we just didn't like her, feels inadequate, a hollow explanation for an act of such profound cruelty. Some have speculated about jealousy, about secrets that Skyler may have known, about the toxic dynamics that can develop in teenage friendships when insecurity and resentment fester unchecked. But no explanation can truly make sense of what Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf did, or the calculated coldness with which they carried it out. Skyler Niece was 16 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her: college, career, love, family, all the experiences that define a full and meaningful life. Instead, her story ends in a wooded area in Pennsylvania, her last moments filled with terror and betrayal as the two people she trusted most in the world turned on her with knives. She fought to live, but she was overpowered and outnumbered, and she died believing, perhaps, that her friends had become something monstrous. In Star City, West Virginia, there is now a memorial bench dedicated to Skyler's memory, a place where people can sit and reflect on a life cut tragically short. Her parents visit it regularly, bringing flowers and speaking to their daughter as if she might hear them. They have never fully healed, and they never will. The pain of losing a child is compounded by the manner of her death and the cruelty of those who took her from them. The case of Skyler Niece remains a stark reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary facades, how friendship can turn to murder, and how the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us most deeply. It is a story of betrayal, of evil disguised as camaraderie, and of a family's relentless fight to find justice for a daughter who will never come home. Story 5. On a crisp Monday morning in November 2003, the suburban landscape of Powder Springs, Georgia, hummed with the ordinary rhythm of American life. The Oakland subdivision, a freshly developed cluster of homes nestled in Cobb County, just northwest of Atlanta, represented the kind of dream that drew young families to the area. New construction, spacious lots, and the promise of a fresh start in a safe neighborhood. At the heart of that promise stood a model home, carefully staged with furniture and decorated to help prospective buyers envision their future. Inside that model home was a small sales office where two women worked, their lives dedicated to helping others find their piece of the American dream. Cynthia Williams was 33 years old, a woman whose warmth and professionalism had earned her respect in the competitive world of real estate. Those who knew her described a person who had found her calling in connecting people with homes, someone who understood that behind every sale was a family's hopes and anxieties. She was married, building a life of her own even as she helped others build theirs. Her colleagues appreciated her willingness to mentor, to share knowledge, to lift up those around her. Among those she had taken under her wing was Lorie Brown, just 21 years old and brimming with the enthusiasm of youth. Friends described Lorie as outgoing and caring, someone whose energy filled a room and whose kindness left lasting impressions. She was engaged to a police officer, planning a wedding and a future that seemed bright with possibility. For Lorie, working alongside Cindy at the Oakland sales office was not just a job, but an apprenticeship, a chance to learn from someone she admired while earning a living in a field she found exciting. On November 3, 2003, both women arrived at work with no reason to believe the day would be anything other than routine. Lorie had spent the morning with her mother, Linda, who also worked in real estate for the same company. They had attended a meeting together, then grabbed lunch at a Wendy's drive-thru, sharing the casual conversation of a mother and daughter who worked side by side. Around 1:10 in the afternoon, they parted ways, with Lorie heading back to the Oakland sales office. Linda watched her daughter drive away, unaware that it would be the last time she would see her alive. Cindy Williams had also taken a lunch break, returning home briefly before heading back to the office around 12:30. The afternoon stretched ahead with the possibility of walk-in clients, phone calls from interested buyers, and the paperwork that filled the quieter moments of a real estate agent's day. The model home sat in a developing area where construction continued on nearby lots, where the sound of hammers and saws mixed with the occasional passing car. It was the kind of place where people came and went freely, where a stranger walking through the door could easily be a potential customer. Shortly before 12:40 that afternoon, Stacy Ian Humphreys entered the sales office. He was 30 years old, a large man, over 6 feet tall, bald, and imposing in his physical presence. He had worked as a laborer on construction sites, including in the very subdivision where Cindy and Lorie worked, giving him familiarity with the layout and routines of the area. But on this November afternoon, he arrived not as a contractor or a customer, but as a predator, armed with a stolen 9mm Ruger handgun and intentions that were as calculated as they were brutal. Humphreys was a convicted felon, having served time for theft, and he had been released from prison just 13 months earlier. He was still on parole, supposed to be rebuilding his life under supervision, but instead he had planned something unspeakable. When he entered the office, he found Cindy Williams alone. What followed was a nightmare that unfolded in stages, each more horrifying than the last. Using the handgun to control her, Humphreys forced Cindy to undress, stripping away not just her clothing but her dignity and sense of safety. He demanded her ATM card and the personal identification number that would allow him access to her bank account. Then, in a chillingly methodical act, he used the office phone to call her bank, checking her account balance to see how much money he could steal. While he held her captive, Humphreys took her underwear and tied it tightly around her neck, strangling her until her face turned purple and her tongue protruded from her mouth. The ligature mark left on her neck would later testify to the force he used, the deliberate cruelty of suffocating another human being while she was utterly defenseless. As Cindy struggled for air, Humphreys forced her down onto her hands and knees and made her crawl into Lorie Brown's office, positioning her behind Lorie's desk. Then, with cold precision, he placed the handgun against her back. To muffle the sound of gunfire, he positioned a bag of balloons between the weapon and her body. He fired once, the bullet tearing through her back and piercing both her lung and her heart. Then he fired again, this time shooting her through the head. Cindy Williams collapsed, left face down in a position that spoke to her final moments of terror and helplessness. Shortly after 1:10, Lorie Brown returned to the office from her lunch with her mother. She had no warning, no chance to flee. She walked into a scene already stained with violence, and into the path of a man who had just murdered her colleague and mentor. Humphreys repeated his grotesque ritual with Lorie. He forced the young woman to undress, demanded her ATM card and PIN, and called her bank to check her balance. Then he made her kneel on the floor with her head facing down. Standing over her, he used both the bag of balloons and Lorie's own folded blouse to muffle the sound as he fired a single shot through her head. She died instantly, her dreams of a wedding and a future with her fiancé extinguished in a moment of senseless brutality. After killing both women, Humphreys dragged Lorie's body to her desk and collected what he had come for: their driver's licenses, ATM cards, and credit cards. Neither woman had sustained defensive wounds, a heartbreaking detail that underscored how completely they had been controlled and overpowered. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Humphreys left the scene, driving away in his black Dodge Durango as if nothing had happened. The bodies were discovered later that afternoon when a builder arrived at the sales office and found the door unlocked. He walked inside, perhaps calling out for Cindy or Lorie, and instead found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He discovered Lorie's body first, then saw Cindy's body positioned under the desk where she had been executed. He immediately called 911, his voice likely shaking as he tried to explain what he was seeing. The responding police officers from the Cobb County Police Department entered the model home and confronted the grim reality of a double homicide. Sergeant Eddie Herman, who would later describe the scene as brutal and almost inhumane, began coordinating what would become an intensive investigation. The crime scene investigators meticulously documented everything: the positions of the bodies, the ligature mark on Cindy's neck, the absence of shell casings despite clear evidence of gunfire, the missing wallets and bank cards. They found paper with indentations of numbers on it, suggesting someone had written down information, possibly the pins that the killer had forced his victims to reveal. Phone records from the office showed 2 calls made between 1:10 and 1:45 that afternoon to 800 numbers, which investigators quickly determined were bank customer service lines. The timeline was becoming clear. The killer had methodically stolen financial information and checked account balances before murdering both women. Detectives immediately began interviewing those closest to the victims. Cindy's husband and Lorie's fiancé, a police officer, were both questioned and their alibis verified. Herman and his team quickly ruled out any domestic angle or the possibility of a hired hit. This was something else entirely, a targeted attack by someone who had come prepared to rob and kill. A crucial break came when investigators canvassed the neighborhood and found a real estate agent who had been at the subdivision around the time of the murders. This witness had seen a suspicious individual, a large, white, bald man in his early 30s, over 6 feet tall, driving a black Dodge Durango. Working with law enforcement, the witness helped create a composite sketch. When the families of the victims could not identify the man in the drawing, police released it to the media. Tips began pouring in. One call came from someone at a construction job site who recognized both the description and the vehicle. They matched a worker named Stacy Humphreys, who had failed to show up for work on the day of the murders. More compelling still, Humphreys had previously worked at the Oakwind subdivision, giving him intimate knowledge of the sales office and the routines of the real estate agents who worked there. Police began investigating Humphreys and made arrangements through his parole officer to meet with him on the morning of November 7, 2003, 4 days after the murders. But Humphreys never showed up for the meeting. Officers who had been conducting surveillance watched as he slipped away, realizing he was fleeing. The hunt was on. The following day, November 8, 2003, Humphreys was apprehended in Wisconsin, hundreds of miles from the crime scene. When police searched the rental vehicle he had been driving, they found the 9mm Ruger pistol in the console, the murder weapon. Forensic analysis would later reveal that swabbings from the gun contained blood with Cindy Williams' DNA. Additionally, a stain on the driver's side floor mat of Humphreys' Dodge Durango was determined to be blood containing Lorie Brown's DNA. The evidence was overwhelming. After the murders, the victims' ATM cards had been used to withdraw over $3,000 from their accounts. The physical evidence, the witness descriptions, the flight from law enforcement, and the financial trail all pointed to one conclusion. Stacy Humphreys had murdered Cindy Williams and Lorie Brown in cold blood. Humphreys was extradited back to Georgia to face justice. In 2004, a Cobb County grand jury indicted him on charges of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, kidnapping with bodily injury, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The state filed notice that it would seek the death penalty. The trial began on September 18, 2007, nearly 4 years after the murders. For the families of Cindy Williams and Lorie Brown, sitting through the proceedings meant confronting in excruciating detail the final moments of their loved ones' lives. They heard testimony about the forced undressing, the phone calls to check bank balances, the strangulation, the execution-style shootings. They learned about the bag of balloons used to muffle gunshots, the deliberate positioning of bodies, the complete absence of mercy. On September 25, 2007, the jury found Humphreys guilty of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, armed robbery, and kidnapping with bodily injury. He pleaded guilty to the charge of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The trial then moved to the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide whether Humphreys should receive the death penalty. It was during the sentencing deliberations that a troubling element emerged, one that would haunt the case for years to come. A juror named Chancey had revealed during jury selection that she had once been the victim of a crime, An escaped murderer had attempted to rob and assault her at her home, though she had managed to escape before he got inside. She had sworn under oath that she could be fair and would honestly consider all three sentencing options: life with parole, life without parole, and death. But during deliberations, Chancey disclosed to her fellow jurors a much more traumatic version of events. The attacker had actually assaulted her while she was naked in her bed. Based on that experience, the jury foreperson later reported, Chancey had her mind made up from day one of the trial that Humphreys deserved to die. When deliberations became contentious, with three jurors initially favoring life without parole, Chancey's behavior became increasingly aggressive. She yelled, cursed, and screamed that she would stay here forever, if that's what it took for Humphreys to get death. She threw the victims' photographs across the table, demanding, "Do you want this to happen to someone you know?" She falsely told other jurors that they had to reach a unanimous decision or Humphreys would be paroled, personally attacked them, and refused to engage in meaningful discussion. She put her feet up on the table and announced she was digging in and would not change her vote. The jury foreperson, Susan Barber, became so distressed that she locked herself in the bathroom and cried. She later expressed that she felt they had run out of options because she thought that unanimity was our only choice. After 8 hours of deliberations over 2 days, the three jurors who had initially favored life without parole finally relented. On September 30th, 2007, the jury recommended a sentence of death for each of Humphreys' 2 murder convictions, having found 10 statutory aggravating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial court sentenced Humphreys to death, along with additional consecutive life sentences for kidnapping and armed robbery. For nearly 2 decades, Humphreys has remained on death row, pursuing appeals through state and federal courts. His legal team has argued that the juror misconduct, Chancey's failure to fully disclose her traumatic experience during jury selection, and her coercive behavior during deliberations, tainted his death sentence and violated his constitutional rights. In October 2024, the United States Supreme Court denied his petition for review. 3 justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, issued a dissent, arguing that the sentence was tainted by a single juror's extraordinary misconduct, and that lower courts had applied the wrong legal standards. Justice Sotomayor wrote that Chancey snapped during deliberations and that her actions amounted to coercion that denied Humphreys a fair sentencing proceeding. Despite the dissent, the majority of the court declined to intervene. On December 2, 2025, the Georgia Department of Corrections announced that Stacey Ian Humphreys would be executed on December 17, 2025. The case of Stacey Humphreys is a story of unspeakable violence visited upon 2 innocent women who were simply doing their jobs, helping families find homes in a growing suburban community. Cindy Williams and Lorie Brown deserved to live full lives, to celebrate milestones, to grow old with the people they loved. Instead, they were targeted by a man who saw them not as human beings, but as opportunities for theft, their lives disposable obstacles to his criminal goals. For their families, no amount of legal justice can restore what was taken. Lorie's mother, Linda, lost not just a daughter, but a colleague with whom she had shared lunch just hours before the murder. Lorie's fiancé lost the woman he planned to marry, the future they had imagined together. Cindy's husband lost his partner, and her colleagues lost a mentor and friend whose kindness had made their own professional lives richer. What remains indisputable is the horror of what happened on November 3, 2003, in a model home in Powder Springs. 2 women went to work and never came home. Their final moments were filled with terror, degradation, and pain. They were forced to kneel, to reveal personal information, to endure humiliation before being executed with a calculated cruelty that speaks to the darkest capacities of human nature. As the execution date approaches, the names Cindy Williams and Lorie Brown should be remembered not as victims of crime statistics, but as real people whose lives mattered, whose absence left holes in families and communities that can never be filled. They were daughters, a fiancé, a wife, a mentor, a friend. They smiled and worked and dreamed, until the day a man with a gun decided their lives were worth less than the money in their bank accounts. In the end, this is what remains: the memory of two women who deserved better, the families who continued to grieve them, and the enduring question of whether justice, imperfect and complicated as it always is, has truly been served. Story 6. The early morning darkness of July 31st, 2017, held the promise of an ordinary Monday in the small Brazilian town of Ipira, Goiás. At precisely 5:31 a.m., a car pulled out of a quiet driveway, carrying a young family on a journey they had made countless times before. Inside sat 35-year-old Vanessa Kamargo Soares, 5 months pregnant with her second child, her husband Horacio Rosendo de Araújo Neto, and their sleeping toddler son, just 1 year and 9 months old. The 140-mile drive to Goiânia was part of their weekly routine, a carefully choreographed balance between Vanessa's career and their family life. But this Monday morning would not end in the usual way. By the time the sun rose over the highway, Vanessa would be dead, and a small town would be left grappling with a crime so calculated and cold that it would shake their community to its core. Vanessa had been born in Ipira on December 24th, 1988, a Christmas Eve baby who brought light into her mother's life. Her father died when she was just 2 years old, leaving her mother, Nilva Maria Soares, to raise Vanessa and her older sister Bruna alone. The loss shaped the family profoundly, binding the three women together in mutual support and resilience. Nilva worked in agriculture, modeling diligence and determination for her daughters, instilling in them values of education and hard work despite the hardships they faced. Vanessa embraced those lessons with remarkable dedication. After completing high school, she pursued higher education with a passion that impressed everyone who knew her. She earned a degree in biology from the State University of Goiás in 2009, then continued her studies, completing additional coursework in educational technology in 2011 and earning a degree in agricultural sciences in 2013. To those around her, Vanessa was a shining example of a young woman who balanced professional dedication with warmth and kindness in her personal life. She was bright, driven, and deeply dependable, someone who moved forward with quiet confidence and strong values. Vanessa and Horacio had been together for approximately 5 years before they married in 2014. At first glance, Horacio seemed like the ideal partner. Among friends and family, he came across as calm and well-mannered, never raising his voice or showing disrespect toward Vanessa in public. He appeared to be a stable, attentive man, the kind of partner who inspired confidence. Vanessa's loved ones were convinced she had made the right choice, that she had found someone with whom she could build a real home. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Horacio was 35 years old at the time of the tragedy, and his life appeared closely tied to his family, especially his father, who exerted a strong influence over many aspects of the couple's married life. Outwardly, Horacio maintained the image of a responsible husband and caring father, but over time, troubling patterns emerged. There was a controlling nature, a dependency on his family's opinions, and an intense preoccupation with financial matters that went beyond normal concern. In 2015, the couple welcomed their first child, a son who became the center of their lives. Then, at the start of 2017, Vanessa discovered she was pregnant again, and doctors told her she was carrying a girl. The news brought her an extra kind of joy, and she proudly shared with her loved ones that she had chosen the name Isis for her daughter. Her dream of raising both a son and a daughter was coming true, and from the outside, it looked like the couple was building a stronger marriage and growing as a family. But the reality was far more complicated. Vanessa began feeling increasing pressure from her father-in-law, whose interference in their household affairs had become overbearing. On top of that, she and Horacio were arguing more frequently about the future, disagreements that signaled deeper tensions in the relationship. By spring 2017, just 4 months before the tragedy, Vanessa started talking about divorce. She explained to those close to her that she and Horacio could no longer see eye to eye on key issues, and that her father-in-law's constant interference had made family life intolerable. Vanessa's professional life was rooted in Goiânia, where she managed the commercial department of a store downtown. She oversaw sales operations, managed staff schedules, handled product displays, and reviewed financial reports. Contracts with suppliers, daily performance metrics, and cash handling procedures all required her direct involvement. While some responsibilities could be handled remotely, the key decisions were made on site, and the outcomes rested entirely on her shoulders. The distance between her home in Ypres and the store in Goiânia was about 140 miles, roughly a 4-hour drive depending on road conditions. The route was not easy, with limited infrastructure that meant every trip had to be carefully planned. Every Sunday night, the family packed everything they needed: work materials, documents, clothes, baby items, and a small medical kit. Early Monday morning, they would hit the road so Vanessa could be at the store when it opened. The family stayed in Goiânia through Thursday, then made the trip back to Ypres. Pregnancy did not change Vanessa's standards at work. She carefully managed her workload, delegated tasks to her lead shift supervisor, and planned her doctor's appointments in advance. Her schedule was arranged to avoid late-night drives and unnecessary strain. When needed, Horacio stepped in for logistics, handling grocery shopping, daycare runs, and household errands. Family members back in Ypres filled in when the couple was in town, helping with home responsibilities. On paper, the setup looked manageable. 4 days in the city, 3 back home. But in reality, every weekly cycle required flawless planning, and one misstep could throw everything off. Despite the mounting exhaustion, Vanessa stayed focused. Her goals were clear: maintain her position, grow professionally, and secure steady income. A career in the capital offered opportunities that simply did not exist back home. What Vanessa's family did not know at the time was that certain financial arrangements had been put in place, details that would later become critical in understanding what happened on that highway. Vanessa had 2 life insurance policies in her name, one for 300,000 reais and another for 86,000 reais. At the time, these were viewed as practical safeguards, a responsible financial step for a young family. The listed beneficiaries were her husband, her sister, and her son. One of the policies carried a notably higher payout in cases of violent death. No one suspected these policies might be tied to something darker, but as investigators would later determine, the insurance money represented a powerful motive. For Horacio, the breakdown of the marriage meant potential financial losses and the end of his role as the head of the household. In contrast, the death of his wife would bring in a sizable insurance payout and eliminate the looming legal disputes over property and custody. On the evening of July 30th, 2017, everything in the house seemed calm. The family finished packing, double-checked the departure time to avoid morning traffic, and ensured that phones were charged and cash and cards were packed separately. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Before bed, Vanessa checked on their son, confirming he had no fever and that bottles and snacks were prepared in case he woke up. That night, there were no complaints. They woke up early and quietly, not wanting to disturb the baby. They checked the weather and traffic conditions, set their arrival time using GPS. Everything lined up with their usual plan. Their son was gently carried to the car and buckled into his seat with a blanket and spare clothes nearby. A bag with water, wipes, and essential medicine was packed separately. Vanessa sat in the front, buckled in, and confirmed with Horacio which route would be best that morning. At 5:31 a.m., their car pulled out of the driveway. The streets were still quiet, traffic lights on short cycles, and there was no congestion. GPS gave them an arrival time that matched Vanessa's scheduled work meetings. Everything was moving like clockwork. The first few miles passed without issue. They maintained a safe speed, with no stops planned until they reached a better-equipped rest area. Inside the car, it was quiet. Their son was still asleep. Vanessa answered a couple of work-related messages, and then put her phone away. According to Horacio's initial testimony, the events that followed happened suddenly and violently. He told investigators that while driving on the highway, their car was approached and forced to stop by two men on a motorcycle. One of the men reportedly came up to the driver's side window, struck the glass with what appeared to be a firearm, and ordered Horacio to pull over. Fearing for the safety of his pregnant wife and their young son, Horacio claimed he complied. He stated that one of the assailants then took the wheel of their car while the other followed on the motorcycle. After a few minutes, according to Horacio, Vanessa asked for the vehicle to stop, and that was when he heard a gunshot. He said he did not see the actual shot fired, but heard the sound and immediately realized Vanessa had been fatally wounded. Once the car came to a stop, the two men reportedly fled the scene on the motorcycle. Horacio said he discovered that his wife had died from the injury, but their child, who had been secured in the back seat, was unharmed. Around that time, another driver noticed the vehicle parked on the side of the road along with a man waving his arms for help. That driver stopped and contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly and pronounced Vanessa deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. There were no signs of a struggle on her body, and no other injuries were documented. The child was taken into protective care by authorities and later released to family members. Crime scene investigators documented the scene meticulously. They took photographs, noted the position of the seats, confirmed the presence of a child safety seat, and created a full diagram of the area. The highway lane was temporarily closed, and the area was marked with police tape. Their report included the time of the emergency call and response, the condition of the vehicle's interior, seatbelt usage, the pregnancy, and the absence of any shell casings or firearms. Critically, no visible damage to the window or vehicle body was found, despite Horacio's claims that the glass had been struck. Initial questioning of Horacio took place right there at the scene. His version was brief. Two men on a motorcycle hit the glass, ordered them down, fired a gunshot, then ran. At the station, he repeated his account, but added that he had not seen the attackers' faces, could not recall what they were wearing, did not recognize the make of the motorcycle, and could not identify the weapon. He insisted he acted under duress and had no other options. Vanessa was laid to rest in Ypres. At the funeral, Horacio appeared distraught. He stayed close to Vanessa's mother and sister, repeatedly apologizing, saying he had failed to protect her. The family mourned quietly, offering no open accusations. To the outside world, he remained a man who had survived a roadside attack and the loss of his wife and unborn daughter. After the funeral, investigators began systematically verifying Horacio's story, and cracks quickly appeared. Their first step was checking traffic cameras and surveillance footage from nearby gas stations. At the specified time, only one motorcycle was recorded on that stretch of road, ridden by a lone individual who turned off soon after. That rider was identified and their alibi confirmed. No other motorcycles were seen in the area. The driver who called emergency services provided critical timing details. According to his account, he only saw the family's vehicle and a man standing by the roadside. There was no sign of any other individuals nearby. Comparing the time he stopped with when the incident supposedly occurred revealed a gap too short for two unknown assailants to have fled the scene unnoticed. The vehicle was then subjected to a thorough forensic examination. No marks or impact damage were found on the windows or frame. No evidence supported the claim that the glass had been struck with a hard object. The interior showed no signs of a struggle. A ballistics report confirmed the shot had been fired at close range. Speed camera data showed the car had been moving steadily, making it unlikely that a motorcyclist could have pulled alongside and attacked as described. Phone records and GPS tracking confirmed that at the time of the incident, there were only 3 people in the car: Vanessa, her husband, and their child. The emergency call came solely from the other driver, who had pulled over after the fact. There was no evidence of contact with any third parties during the critical window of time. One of the most pivotal steps in the investigation was the forensic blood analysis. Investigators closely examined blood traces found inside the vehicle on seats, panels, and clothing. Special focus was given to the shape and location of the bloodstains to determine how they ended up there. The findings from this analysis contradicted Horacio's testimony, in which he claimed he was lying on the floor at the time the shot was fired. Traces of blood were found on Horacio's clothing, tiny droplets across his chest and sleeves. This kind of spatter pattern typically forms when a person is very close to the point of injury at the exact moment a shot is fired. If Horacio had truly been lying on the floor, as he claimed, the droplets could not have reached those parts of his clothes. The blood distribution clearly indicated that he was near the victim at the level of her head when the shot went off. Even more telling were the blood traces found on the driver's seat. Forensic analysis revealed the direction of the shot and the shooter's position. The results were conclusive. At the moment of the gunfire, Horacio was sitting behind the wheel. That finding completely dismantled his claim that an unknown attacker had been driving. Investigators also reconstructed Vanessa's position when the fatal shot occurred. Her arms and legs were crossed, and her head rested gently against the side window. That posture suggested she had been asleep. The absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle confirmed that the attack came without warning when she was completely relaxed. That effectively ruled out the version of an external ambush. Another key clue came from the blood spatter on the front dashboard. Forensic experts determined that the direction and angle of the blood spray indicated the shot came from inside the car, from the driver's side to the left of the victim. This reconstruction left no doubt. The shot was fired from within the vehicle by the person in the driver's seat, Horacio himself. During court hearings, forensic specialists explained that the blood evidence was central to understanding what happened inside that car. The blood on Horacio's clothes showed he was close to the victim at the time of the shot. The blood patterns on the driver's seat showed exactly where he was sitting, and Vanessa's peaceful position proved she had not resisted or even realized what was about to happen. Together, the evidence pointed to one conclusion: there had been no outside attack. Investigators also dug deeper into the family's background. Vanessa's mother, Nilva, and her sister, Bruna, revealed that in the months leading up to the tragedy, Vanessa had talked about filing for divorce. She had expressed frustration with her father-in-law's constant interference and the growing tension at home. These statements contradicted the image of a happy family that Horacio had presented. A financial review uncovered the 2 life insurance policies in Vanessa's name. This detail was flagged by investigators as a potential motive. Investigators identified 3 interconnected motives that led Horacio to commit the crime. The first was financial, stemming from the potential payout from Vanessa's life insurance policies. The second was material, connected to his fear of losing assets and custody arrangements if the marriage ended. And the third was psychological, the need for control, his refusal to let Vanessa make her own choices, particularly her decision to move forward with a divorce. The prosecution's final version of events laid out a clear picture. Financial gain combined with a desire to maintain control over family decisions served as the main driving forces behind the crime. For Horacio, the breakdown of the marriage meant potential financial losses and the end of his role as the head of the household. In contrast, the death of his wife would bring in a sizable insurance payout and eliminate the looming legal disputes over property and custody. Forensic experts emphasized that this act was not impulsive. It was cold, calculated, and selfish, eliminating a partner to avoid the consequences of divorce and to keep control of resources. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from the timeline established through cell tower data and GPS tracking. It showed that the vehicle continued driving for approximately 40 minutes after Vanessa had already suffered the fatal gunshot wound. During this time, investigators believe Horacio had the opportunity to dispose of the weapon. The firearm was never recovered. Searches of roadside ditches, drains, and nearby bodies of water yielded nothing. But the absence of the weapon did not undermine the case. Ballistics analysis reconstructed the trajectory of the shot using the wound path and microscopic residue found inside the car. The theory that someone fired from outside the vehicle was not supported by a single shred of physical evidence. When investigators searched Horacio's residence, they found ammunition matching the caliber of the bullet used in the shooting. Forensics linked the markings, shell geometry, and batch codes to the same type of round recovered from the crime scene. Although they could not perform a conclusive match between the bullet and a specific gun since no firearm was found, the forensic compatibility further strengthened the prosecution's argument. This case stretched on for years, becoming a massive investigation that filled over 14 volumes of documents. Meanwhile, the court also had to address custody of Vanessa's young son. Her mother, Nilva, and sister, Bruna, fought for legal guardianship. At first, the court granted temporary custody. Eventually, a final ruling awarded full custody to Vanessa's family, citing the need to protect the child's safety and ensure a stable upbringing. The first courtroom session concluded on November 7, 2020. Due to the pandemic, the trial, jury and all, was streamed online, allowing residents from the community to follow each step of the proceedings. The jury was selected through a random draw, with both legal teams allowed to make challenges before arguments began. The prosecution laid out its case with powerful evidence, a detailed blood spatter analysis, ballistic findings proving the shot was fired from close range, no signs of outside intrusion or struggle, a comprehensive breakdown of the vehicle's movements, the delayed emergency call, and the suspicious terms of the life insurance policies, all building toward a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. The defense built its case around the claim that an external attack had taken place, denying Horacio's involvement in the fatal shot. Their argument centered on his supposed inability to resist and the state of shock he allegedly experienced afterward. The court allowed the defense full procedural rights. They were permitted to question forensic experts, propose alternate interpretations of the bullet's trajectory, and challenge the prosecution's reading of the evidence. Still, contradictions in Horacio's own statements conflicting with the physical evidence, combined with the clear financial motive, eroded any credibility the defense's version might have had. The jury ultimately found Horacio Rosendo de Araujo guilty on the main charges: the murder of his wife under aggravating circumstances, resulting in the death of their unborn daughter, and committing the act in the presence of a small child, an additional aggravating factor under law. The judge sentenced him to 29 years, 6 months, and 20 days in prison to be served in a facility appropriate for the crime's severity. The court also noted that Horacio had used prohibited methods to conceal evidence and attempted to stage the crime scene to mislead investigators. The verdict was announced publicly. Vanessa's family saw the ruling as long-awaited justice. In Ypres, citizens held marches and vigils in her memory, honoring both Vanessa and her unborn child. For a town that had lived under the weight of this case for years, the verdict felt like closure and a message that truth had prevailed. But soon after the sentencing, the defense filed an appeal. Pending review, the court allowed Horacio to remain free. Technically, the conviction was not overturned, but the punishment's enforcement became tangled in legal disputes. Hearings were postponed, motions filed, and rulings contested. In practical terms, Ypres was left with a disturbing reality. A man found guilty of murder was still walking freely through the same streets. Reports began circulating that Horacio had started a new family and that he now had a daughter. Those rumors reignited deep resentment among the community, especially among those who had loved and supported Vanessa. For Vanessa's family, seeing him living freely was unbearable. Her mother expressed the town's collective outrage, questioning how someone convicted of such a heinous crime could continue his life as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Nilva and Bruna took full responsibility for raising Vanessa's son. They focused on providing stability, a strong educational foundation, and emotional protection, shielding him from the trauma of his past until he is old enough to understand. Yet one question continued to echo through Ypres, a question no legal document could truly answer. How can a man found guilty of such a crime still be free? Legal experts explained it as a byproduct of Brazil's appeals system and constitutional rights ensuring due process. But for the people of Ipera, it felt like something far simpler, an unbridgeable gap between the letter of the law and the common sense of justice. Vanessa Kamargo was more than a victim, more than a headline in a true crime story. She was a daughter who lost her father at 2 years old, but grew up to honor his memory through her own strength and determination. She was a sister who shared an unbreakable bond with Bruna, who stood by her through every challenge. She was a mother who loved her son with fierce devotion, and who dreamed of holding her daughter Isis in her arms. She was a professional who refused to let distance or difficulty stop her from building a career and securing her family's future. She was a woman who made the difficult decision to leave an unhappy marriage, who stood up for herself even when it meant confronting the expectations and interference of those who wanted to control her. On that July morning in 2017, as Vanessa sat in the passenger seat of a car driven by her husband, she was sleeping peacefully, perhaps dreaming of the future she was trying to build for herself and her children. She never knew what was coming. She never had a chance to defend herself, to scream, to run, to fight back. The man she had trusted, the father of her children, the person who should have protected her, took her life in a single, calculated moment while their toddler son sat strapped in his car seat just feet away. The shot that killed Vanessa also killed her unborn daughter, Isis, the little girl she would never get to meet. The tragedy that unfolded on that highway was not a random act of violence. It was not an attack by strangers or a robbery gone wrong. It was murder, plain and simple, committed by someone who valued money and control more than the life of the woman who had given him a family. The forensic evidence left no room for doubt. The blood on Horacio's clothing, the patterns on the driver's seat, the trajectory of the bullet, the absence of any external attacker, all pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. For the people of Ipera, Vanessa's case became a symbol of something larger, a reminder of the violence that can hide behind closed doors and pleasant facades. Her death sparked conversations about domestic violence, about financial abuse, about the ways controlling partners isolate and manipulate their victims. It forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about how easy it is to overlook warning signs, to assume that a calm exterior means everything is fine. Vanessa's mother and sister carry her memory forward every day, not just in their grief, but in their determination to raise her son with love and to keep fighting for justice. They want the world to know that Vanessa was not defined by how she died, but by how she lived with courage, with purpose, with dreams for a better future. As the legal appeals continue and the painful reality of Horacio's freedom persists, one truth remains constant. Vanessa Kamargo Suarez deserved better. She deserved a partner who respected her, a marriage built on equality rather than control, and the chance to watch her children grow up. Instead, her life was stolen on a quiet highway at dawn, and a community was left to grieve for the woman, the mother, and the unborn child who were lost that terrible July morning. Story 7. The warm Florida sunshine filtered through the windows of the new house in Land O'Lakes, casting golden light across empty rooms waiting to be filled with furniture and memories. For 47-year-old Galen Eugene Therno, known to everyone as Gene, this house represented something profound. A fresh start, a second chance at happiness after the painful dissolution of his first marriage. November 1st, 2006, should have been a day of celebration, an opportunity to share his new beginning with friends who had become part of his Florida life. Gene Therno had taken a winding path to arrive at this moment. An Air Force veteran who had served his country with distinction, he had built a successful career as an air traffic controller, a profession demanding precision, calm under pressure, and absolute reliability. For years, he had worked at a control tower in Nebraska, guiding aircraft safely through the skies while building a life with his wife. But marriages sometimes fracture despite best intentions, and when Gene's first marriage ended in divorce, the pain had been overwhelming. The house they had shared together, the routines they had built, everything reminded him of what he had lost. Seeking escape from the memories that haunted him in Nebraska, Gene made a bold decision. He requested a transfer to Florida, specifically to the St. Pete/Clearwater International Airport. The transfer was approved, and in early 2006, Gene moved south to the Sunshine State, leaving behind the cold Nebraska winters and the ghosts of his failed marriage. Florida welcomed him with warm weather, palm trees, and most importantly, proximity to family members who could help him rebuild his life. At the St. Pete/Clearwater Airport, Gene's warm personality and natural gregariousness made him an instant favorite among his colleagues. Air traffic control is a high-stress profession, but Gene had a way of lightening the mood, of making people feel at ease even during the most demanding shifts. He was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who asked about your family, who genuinely cared about the people around him. His colleagues appreciated his competence and professionalism, but they loved his humanity. Among those colleagues was Juanita Formoso, who went by the nickname JJ. She was 48 years old, a fellow air traffic controller with her own story of resilience and survival. Gene and Juanita connected in the way that sometimes happens between people who have weathered storms and come out the other side. Their friendship deepened into romance, and after a period of dating, they decided to marry. Gene had found love again, proof that heartbreak doesn't have to be permanent, that new chapters can be written even after painful endings. The couple's decision to purchase a house together in Land O'Lakes represented their commitment to building a future together. They spent months watching the construction progress, excited about each milestone. Finally, the house was ready, and on November 1st, they decided to invite a colleague over to celebrate, to share their joy with someone who had been part of their Florida journey. That colleague was Robert Dean Peterson, known as Bob. He was 48 years old, roughly the same age as Gene and Juanita, and he worked alongside them in air traffic control at the airport. On the surface, Bob Peterson seemed unremarkable, just another professional doing a demanding job. But beneath that ordinary exterior, Bob Peterson carried a secret that had been consuming him for years, a secret that would turn Juanita and Gene's celebration into their worst nightmare. What neither Gene nor Juanita fully understood was that Bob Peterson had fallen in love with Gene the very first time he saw him. It wasn't a casual attraction or a passing infatuation. It was an all-consuming obsession that had dictated Peterson's life choices for years. When Gene had transferred from Nebraska to Florida, Peterson had followed him, also requesting a transfer to the St. Pete/Clearwater Airport. He told people he wanted a change of scenery, but the truth was simpler and more troubling. He couldn't bear to be separated from Gene Therno. Peterson's obsession manifested in behaviors that, in retrospect, were clear warning signs. He followed Gene around constantly, always finding excuses to be near him, to be part of his life. When Gene sold the furnished home he had owned before marrying Juanita, Peterson bought it. He wasn't just buying a house, he was buying a piece of Gene's history, a physical space where Gene had lived and breathed. When the sale was finalized and Peterson discovered that Gene's linens weren't included with the furnishings, he became upset and angry, as if he had been denied something precious. Juanita noticed Peterson's behavior and found it odd. He seemed to hover around Gene, always watching, always present. But she rationalized it, telling herself that Peterson was probably just lonely, that he was seeking friendship in a new place. She had no way of knowing the depth of Peterson's feelings, the obsession that lurked beneath his awkward social interactions. As Gene and Juanita's relationship progressed, and they began building their new house, Peterson found another way to insert himself into their lives. Without their knowledge or permission, he began photographing the construction of their Land O'Lakes home. He documented every stage of the building process, taking pictures of the foundation, the framing, the walls going up, the roof being installed. He compiled these photographs into a collection, creating a secret chronicle of their new beginning. On the evening of November 1st, 2006, Gene and Juanita invited Bob Peterson to see their completed house for the first time. They ordered pizza and spent time showing him around the rooms, sharing their excitement about finally moving in. During the visit, Peterson presented them with a gift, the photo album he had created, documenting their house's construction in meticulous detail. Gene and Juanita accepted the gift, likely touched by what seemed like a thoughtful gesture from a friend. They had no idea that the photographs represented something far darker, evidence of surveillance and obsessive monitoring. As the evening progressed, Juanita needed to leave. She and her adult daughter had to drive to Newport Richey to pick up a truck, a practical errand that would take them away from the house for a couple of hours. She left Gene and Bob Peterson alone together in the new house, expecting to return to find them chatting casually, perhaps discussing work or watching television. She had no reason to worry, no premonition of the horror that was about to unfold. What happened after Juanita left will never be fully known, but investigators pieced together the most likely scenario based on the evidence they later discovered. Once they were alone, Bob Peterson produced a typed letter he had written and addressed to Gene. The letter was a confession, a revelation of feelings Peterson had kept hidden for years. He wrote that he felt like he had been living a lie, that he couldn't continue the deception any longer. He declared his love for Gene Therno, explaining that he had wanted to tell him in person, but had always chickened out. The letter then took a darker turn, making explicit sexual demands. But most chilling of all, the letter turned threatening. Peterson stated clearly that he would not leave the house until complete his demand. It was an ultimatum, a demand backed by the implicit threat of violence. Peterson had already asked God for forgiveness, he wrote, suggesting he knew what he was about to do was wrong, but had decided to do it anyway. Gene was a straightforward man who didn't hold back his feelings. When confronted with Peterson's proposition, he was almost certainly repulsed and made his rejection absolutely clear. He would have told Peterson to leave immediately, would have expressed his shock and disgust at the betrayal of their friendship. Gene had no romantic or sexual interest in men, and certainly not in Bob Peterson. Peterson's reaction to Gene's rejection was swift and violent. He pulled out a .22 caliber handgun and shot Gene in the head. The man he claimed to love, the man he had obsessed over for years, lay bleeding on the floor of his new home. But Peterson wasn't finished. In an act of horrifying brutality, he dragged Gene's wounded or dying body out of the house, leaving a blood trail across the driveway. He forced Gene into his truck and drove him to another location, a house Peterson had rented in Safety Harbor, Florida. The fact that Peterson had a rented house in Safety Harbor, separate from his residence in Covered Bridge Estates in Ellenton, suggested premeditation. He had prepared a location where he could take Gene, a private space where no one would interrupt whatever dark plans he had in mind. When Juanita Therno returned home around 7:30 p.m., expecting to find her husband relaxing with their friend, she instead walked into a nightmare. A blood trail stretched across the driveway, dark and ominous in the gathering twilight. Inside the house, she found Gene's clothes in a bloody pile on the floor. She called his cell phone frantically, and heard it ringing from his discarded pants. Her husband was gone, but his clothes, his phone, everything was there except him. On the end table, Juanita found an envelope addressed to Gene. Inside was the typed letter Peterson had written, his confession of love and his threatening demands. The words on the page made Juanita's blood run cold. She immediately called the police, reporting her husband missing and providing them with the letter that made Bob Peterson the obvious suspect. Law enforcement began searching for both Gene Therno and Bob Peterson, treating the case as a possible kidnapping. Detectives interviewed Juanita extensively, trying to understand the relationship between Gene and Peterson, looking for any clue that might lead them to where Peterson had taken her husband. They learned about Peterson's rental property in Safety Harbor, and that information became the focus of their investigation. 2 agonizing days passed while Juanita waited for news of her husband. On November 3, 2006, law enforcement officers arrived at Peterson's rented house in Safety Harbor. They knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. The silence from inside the house was ominous. Officers forced their way through the door, not knowing what they would find but fearing the worst. The scene that greeted them in the master bedroom was one of unspeakable horror. Gene Therno's body lay on the floor, a bullet wound to his head. But the brutality didn't end with murder. Peterson had mutilated Gene's body. The violence of the act spoke to the depth of Peterson's disturbed mental state, his inability to accept rejection, his need to destroy what he could not possess. Beside Gene's body lay Bob Peterson, also dead from a gunshot wound to the head from the same .22 caliber handgun he had used to kill Gene. Peterson had taken his own life, ending the horror he had created, but leaving behind devastation and unanswered questions. The murder-suicide concluded a tragedy that should never have happened, that might have been prevented if anyone had understood the danger Peterson posed. The investigation revealed the full extent of Peterson's obsession. Detectives found evidence that he had followed Gene from Nebraska to Florida specifically to remain close to him. He had purchased Gene's former home, collected photographs of Gene and Juanita's new house construction, and inserted himself into their lives at every opportunity. His brother Anthony later told investigators that Bob had not hidden the fact that he was gay and spoke of Gene Therno often, though he never indicated they had any kind of relationship. The obsession had been one-sided, fueled entirely by Peterson's imagination and desires. Anthony Peterson also expressed shock at his brother's capacity for violence. "I didn't even think he had a gun," he said. "I didn't think he was capable of doing it. He might have snapped." But this wasn't a sudden snap. The evidence suggested planning and premeditation. Peterson had rented a separate house in Safety Harbor, had brought a gun to Gene and Juanita's home, had written a letter in advance. These were not the actions of someone acting on impulse, but rather someone who had contemplated this outcome, perhaps even rehearsed it in his mind. Juanita Therno was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She had lost her husband of just a few years, a man who had helped her believe in love again, who had been excited about building a future together in their new house. That house, which should have represented joy and new beginnings, had become the site of Gene's kidnapping and the starting point of his murder. In the aftermath, Juanita struggled to make sense of what had happened. Looking back over the 4 years she had known Bob Peterson, she recalled details that now seemed significant but had appeared innocuous at the time. His constant presence around Gene, his purchase of Gene's former home, his disappointment about the linens. All of it formed a pattern she hadn't recognized until it was too late. Despite the horror of what Peterson had done to her husband, Juanita told reporters that she didn't hate him. "How can you hate someone who is mentally disturbed?" she said. She relied on her faith in God to help her through the grief and trauma, the same faith she had shared with Gene. "I miss him terribly," she said. "Where else do you turn? I have to hang on to the fact that my God is a good God." The case of Gene Therno stands as a tragic example of how dangerous unrequited obsession can become, particularly when combined with an inability to accept rejection. Bob Peterson's love, if it can be called that, was not about Gene's happiness or well-being. It was possessive, selfish, and ultimately murderous. When Gene rejected his advances, Peterson chose violence rather than acceptance, destroying the object of his obsession rather than letting him live free. Gene Therno was a man who had survived the pain of divorce and found the courage to start over. He had built a new life in Florida, found new love with Juanita, and was looking forward to the future. He died at 47 years old, killed in the home he had just finished building, murdered by someone he had considered a friend. The tragedy resonates because it reminds us how little we sometimes know about the people around us, how secret obsessions can fester in silence until they explode into violence. In the end, both men died in that Safety Harbor rental house, but only one of them was a victim. Gene Therno was a good man who made the mistake of trusting someone whose twisted feelings would cost him everything. And Juanita was left alone in a house filled with ghosts, trying to find meaning in senseless loss, holding on to faith when everything else had been taken away. Story 8. The summer of 1981 was fading into September in Lakeland, Florida, where the late afternoon sun still carried enough heat to make the air shimmer above the pavement. In a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, Linda Sllayton moved through her daily routines with the practiced efficiency of a single mother raising two boys on her own. At 31, she carried the weight of responsibilities that would have broken many people, but those who knew her described a woman of remarkable resilience, someone who had survived an abusive marriage and emerged determined to build a better life for her sons. Jeff was 15, already showing the independence that comes with approaching adulthood, while 12-year-old Tim still carried that mixture of boyhood enthusiasm and the beginning awareness that life could be difficult. For both boys, their mother was the center of their world, the person who worked hard to keep food on the table, who made sure they had what they needed, who tried to give them moments of normalcy even when money was tight. Linda had recently escaped from her marriage to Frank Sllayton, a man whose abusive behavior had made their home a place of fear rather than safety. Now, in this small apartment, she was trying to create something different, a space where her boys could feel secure, where they could be children. September brought with it the rhythms of a new school year, and for Tim, the excitement of youth football. He had joined a local team, and his coach was a young man named Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe to the boys who looked up to him. Mills was 20 years old, seemingly devoted to working with young athletes, someone the parents trusted with their children. For Tim, who had grown up without a stable father figure, Coach Joe represented something important, a man who showed up, who taught him the game, who seemed to care. On the evening of September 3rd, 1981, Tim had football practice. When it ended, Coach Joe offered to give him a ride home, a kindness that seemed entirely ordinary. Mills pulled up to the apartment complex, and Linda came out to his car to thank him for bringing her son home safely. It was a brief interaction, a mother expressing gratitude to the man who coached her son, nothing more. Tim climbed out of the car, and Mills drove away into the gathering dusk. That night, the Sllayton family had plans to attend a party at a neighbor's apartment. It was the kind of casual gathering that dotted suburban life. Neighbors getting together, children playing, adults talking over drinks. Jeff had already left earlier to spend time with his grandparents. Linda and Tim went to the party next door, and for a few hours, there was laughter and conversation, the ordinary sounds of people trying to enjoy the end of a summer evening. Around 11 o'clock, Linda told Tim it was time to head home. They walked the short distance back to their apartment, and she sent her son to bed. Tim went to his room, exhausted from practice and the long day, and fell asleep quickly. Jeff had returned from his grandparents and was sleeping on a cot in the living room. Linda said goodnight to her boys, closed her bedroom door, and prepared for bed, unaware that someone was already waiting for her in the darkness. Joseph Mills had returned. After dropping Tim off earlier that evening, Mills had come back to the apartment complex while the family was at the party next door. He had removed the screen from Linda's bedroom window, climbed inside, and concealed himself in her closet. The detectives who would later reconstruct the crime believed he had been there for hours, waiting in the confined space, listening to the sounds of the apartment, biding his time until Linda was alone and vulnerable. When she entered her bedroom and closed the door, Mills emerged from his hiding place. What followed was an attack of horrifying brutality. He overpowered her, and despite her desperate struggle to defend herself, he physically assaulted her. Linda fought. The lacerations on her neck would testify to her frantic attempts to pull the wire coat hanger away as Mills wrapped it around her throat and twisted it tighter and tighter. She clawed at the wire, trying to breathe, trying to live, but Mills continued to strangle her until her body went still. In the other rooms, her sons slept on, hearing nothing. The walls of the small apartment, the closed doors, the exhaustion of youth, all of it conspired to keep them unaware that their mother was being murdered just feet away. Mills left the same way he had entered, climbing back out through the bedroom window and disappearing into the night. Linda's body remained in her bed, partially nude, the wire hanger still wrapped around her neck, her bedroom window open to the humid Florida air. The next morning, September 4th, 1981, Linda's sister arrived at the apartment. When she received no answer to her knocks, she entered and made her way toward Linda's bedroom. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. She immediately called the police, her voice likely breaking as she tried to explain what she was seeing. The crackle of police radios filled the small apartment as officers from the Lakeland Police Department arrived and secured the scene. Sergeant Edgar Pickett was among the first responders, and he would later recall the overwhelming sense of tragedy that permeated that morning. The sound of the radios woke Jeff, who had been sleeping in the living room. He sat up, confused, and watched as officers moved through the apartment with grim expressions. Someone told him that his mother was dead, that she had been murdered. Tim woke up to the same nightmare. The boys were suddenly alone in a world that had become incomprehensible. Their mother, the person who had protected them, who had fought to give them a better life, was gone. And they had been sleeping just rooms away when it happened, unable to hear her cries, unable to save her. Sergeant Pickett looked at Linda's sons that morning and felt a deep determination settle over him. He had children of his own, and the thought of what these boys were experiencing cut through his professional detachment. He wanted to solve this case. He needed to solve it for them. The investigation began immediately. Detectives photographed the crime scene, noting the removed window screen, the position of Linda's body, the wire hanger that had been used as a murder weapon, an item taken from her own closet. They collected a rape kit, carefully preserving biological evidence that they hoped would lead them to the killer. They lifted a palm print from the window ledge where the intruder had entered. Investigators interviewed dozens of people. Linda's abusive ex-husband, Frank Sllayton, became a person of interest. They questioned neighbors, friends, anyone who might have had contact with Linda. In a heartbreaking turn, even Jeff became a suspect for a time, subjected to repeated interrogations by police who were desperate for answers. Lakeland police, they was interrogating me all the time, Jeff would later recall, describing the added trauma of being treated as a potential killer of his own mother. One person who was briefly questioned was Joseph Mills. Just one day after the murder, detectives called him on the phone. During that brief conversation, Mills acknowledged that he had driven Tim Sllayton home from football practice on September 3rd. He said he had only met Linda once, that she had come out to his car to thank him. The interview was cursory, conducted remotely rather than in person, and Mills was never seriously considered a suspect. The fact that he had been at the apartment complex that very evening, that he had seen Linda and knew where she lived, apparently did not trigger any alarm. Despite all the evidence collected, despite the palm print and the DNA preserved in the rape kit, the case went nowhere. There was no match in any database. No suspect emerged who could be definitively linked to the crime. Months turned into years, and the Sllayton case joined the growing pile of cold files that haunt every police department. Cases where victims are known, evidence exists, but the perpetrator remains maddeningly out of reach. For Jeff and Tim Sllayton, those years were marked by a peculiar kind of torture. They lived with the knowledge that their mother's killer was still out there, walking free, perhaps living nearby, perhaps even crossing paths with them on the street. The trauma of that morning never left them. Tim, in particular, carried additional burdens. Coach Joe had continued to be part of his life after the murder, maintaining the relationship as if nothing had happened. Tim had even kept photographs of himself with his football coach, images that would later take on a sinister meaning he could never have imagined. In 1998, a detective named Brad Grice took over the Sllayton case. He represented a new generation of investigators who understood the potential of DNA technology, and he immediately sent the evidence from Linda's rape kit to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. A year later, the lab developed a full DNA profile of Linda Sllayton's killer. It was a major breakthrough, a genetic fingerprint that could definitively identify the murderer, if only they could find someone to match it to. Grice systematically collected DNA samples from prior persons of interest and submitted them for comparison. None matched. The profile sat in the database, waiting for a breakthrough that would not come for another 2 decades. That breakthrough arrived in 2018 when Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy, reached out to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They had been achieving remarkable success using public genealogy databases to solve cold cases, and they asked if Florida had any cases that might benefit from this new investigative technique. The Sllayton case, with its carefully preserved evidence from 37 years earlier, was an ideal candidate. Cece Moore, head of Parabon's genetic genealogy unit, took on the case. Her team uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily share their genetic information in hopes of learning about their ancestry and finding distant relatives. The DNA comparison revealed a family tree, distant cousins who shared genetic markers with Linda Sllayton's murderer. From there, Moore and her team began the painstaking work of building family trees, tracing lineages forward through generations, eliminating branches and following leads until they could identify a specific individual who matched the age, location, and circumstances of the crime. In June 2019, after months of analysis, Parabon investigators told Lakeland police that they had identified a suspect, Joseph Clinton Mills, the man who had been Tim's youth football coach, who had driven him home the night before the murder, who had been briefly questioned and then dismissed as irrelevant. He was Linda Sllayton's killer. The revelation was staggering. Tim Sllayton had looked up to this man. He had ridden in his car, trusted him, kept his photograph. Coach Joe had been present in his life even after the murder, all while carrying the secret of what he had done. Investigators moved carefully. In the summer of 2019, they collected trash from Mills's home and sent it to the lab. The DNA on that trash matched the DNA from Linda Sllayton's rape kit. Authorities also compared Mills's fingerprints, taken when he had been arrested on an unrelated charge in 1984, to the palm print lifted from Linda's window ledge 38 years earlier. They matched. On December 12, 2019, Joseph Clinton Mills was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary with assault and battery. He was 58 years old, still living in Lakeland, having spent nearly 4 decades as a free man while Linda Sllayton's sons grew up without their mother. During his interrogation, Mills showed no emotion. His story changed multiple times, each version more implausible than the last. Initially, he claimed he had never entered Linda's apartment. When confronted with the DNA and fingerprint evidence, he changed his account, claiming that Linda had invited him, that she had already had a wire hanger around her neck when he arrived, and that she had asked him to tighten it during their encounter. He portrayed the entire event as consensual, a fantasy he apparently expected investigators to believe. The detectives did not believe him for a second. The physical evidence told a completely different story, one of forced entry, violent sexual assault, and premeditated murder. Detective Russell Hulley stated flatly, "I think it's pretty evident that he targeted her." The legal proceedings stretched over 2 more years. Mills pleaded not guilty and prepared for trial, maintaining his absurd claim of consensual sex even as prosecutors assembled overwhelming evidence against him. But in February 2022, facing the possibility of the death penalty, Mills changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Linda Sllayton's sons finally had the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Jeff Sllayton, now in his 50s, stood before Mills and let 4 decades of pain pour out. "I hate you. You can't die and burn in hell fast enough for me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a grief that had never fully healed. "I hope when you're in prison, things happen to you. Bad things." Tim Sllayton's words were equally raw. He had lived with an additional layer of betrayal, having trusted Mills, having seen him as a role model. "I saw the crime scene, I saw what you did, and then you act like my friend. I rode in the car with you," Tim told Mills. The image of his coach's face, once associated with football and mentorship, was now forever linked to the horror of what had happened to his mother. Mills spoke briefly at his sentencing, claiming he was a good person. The Sllaytons did not buy it. How could someone who had raped and murdered a defenseless woman, who had left her children to find her body and grow up without her, claim to be good? Tim responded with barely controlled rage. "I got so much hate for you right now." Mills was led away to begin serving his life sentence, and for the Sllayton brothers, there was a measure of closure, though it was bittersweet and incomplete. Their mother's killer would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he never apologized. He never explained why he had targeted Linda that night, why he had betrayed the trust that came with being a coach to children, why he had destroyed so many lives. The case of Linda Sllayton stands as a testament to both the long shadow cast by unsolved crimes and the remarkable power of modern forensic science. For 38 years, her sons lived in a state of suspended grief, knowing their mother had been murdered but unable to see justice served. They grew up haunted by questions, by the fear that the killer might strike again, by the awful possibility that they might never know the truth. The breakthrough came not from traditional detective work, though Brad Grice's dedication to preserving and pursuing the case was essential. It came from the intersection of genetic science and genealogy, from the painstaking work of analysts who could trace family trees through shared DNA and identify individuals separated by multiple generations. Without that technology, it is likely that Joseph Mills would have lived out his life as a free man, his terrible secret buried with him. In Lakeland, the apartment where Linda Sllayton died has long since been occupied by other families, people who may or may not know the history that unfolded within those walls. The city has grown and changed, but for those who remember September 4th, 1981, the memory of that morning, of two boys waking to find their home filled with police, of a young mother whose life was stolen in the cruelest way, remains vivid. Linda Sllayton was more than a victim in a cold case file. She was a survivor of domestic violence who had fought to build a better life for her children. She was a mother who worked hard, who loved her sons, who deserved to watch them grow up, graduate, marry, and have children of their own. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind trusted faces, and a symbol of the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how many years pass. Jeff and Tim Sllayton carry their mother's memory forward, determined that she be remembered not just for how she died, but for who she was and what she fought to give them. They have spoken publicly about their experience, participating in documentaries and interviews, ensuring that Linda's story is told, and that other families know that even decades-old cases can be solved. As Joseph Mills sits in prison, the legacy of his crime extends far beyond one brutal night in 1981. It encompasses the childhood stolen from two boys, the decades of fear and uncertainty that followed, and the countless moments of joy and connection that Linda Sllayton never got to experience. It also encompasses the determination of investigators who refused to let the case die, and the scientists whose work brought a killer to justice nearly 4 decades after he thought he had gotten away with murder. In the end, Linda Sllayton's story is one of violence and loss, but also of persistence, technological progress, and the unbreakable bonds between a mother and her sons, bonds that endured even through death and time, and that ultimately brought a measure of peace to a family that had waited far too long for answers.